particularly unique circumstances in relation to particularly TfL and the settlement we obviously reached with government, which requires a further £20 increase on Band D. And obviously we need to await what the Home Office might say about the police precept. Essentially, the 3% need to be much higher, given the commitments that we've entered into around the Band D for TfL, and obviously decisions to be made by the Mayor around the police precept. There are a number of other issues that I'm sure we may pick up during the meeting around, say, UK SPF, where we're still waiting for the government. Obviously, there's an energy support review that the Chancellor announced for how there may be support for local authorities and ourselves on our premises. There's obviously some statements around investment zones where there's a refocus on sort of science universities, but also to more deprived areas than London. And there's also a loss of the national insurance funding that was previously assumed. Now, the thing I think is probably of most direct relevance, though, is the government has said that they're going to make a policy statement, DLAC are going to make a policy statement in early December, which hopefully will give us greater clarification for some of the issues that we need to resolve before we can get final figures around, albeit that it seems very likely that the provisional settlements for local government, for police, for transport will be very late in the year. Now, as always, I'll be happy to keep the Assembly informed, both formally and informally, as those announcements come forward. Perhaps if I stop there and we can perhaps pick up some of the detailed questions.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about any risk that's been built into where you are in the budget at this point? Inflation you touched on, but what other risks are you looking at, and how are you protecting against them?
Yeah, obviously we await from a group-wide perspective, obviously we await the functional bodies' submissions at the end of this week. For the GLA Mayor budget, obviously the main focus of our scrutiny today, I think the key risks, as you say, are around inflation. Obviously inflation still remains to be what will be the level of real inflation we're going to hit for next year, and that particularly, I think, the issue of the pay award. And you'll note from the papers, obviously, we've increased the provision for a pay award from 2 to 5%, and obviously that remains a major area that we need to go through in consultation with the unions around the pay award for next year. But that obviously is a major risk. I think on the capital programme in particular, there remain huge risks about delivery. Essentially, I think we talked before, because our capital programme is by and large cash limited by government grant, that creates a ceiling, and that has obviously huge consequences in terms of the delivery from our partners around our housing commitments.
Could you flesh out for me the risk around the impact of Brexit as well, which you talked about, paragraph 1.30?
I mean, I guess the risk from Brexit is largely one to do with the economy, on London's impact on the economy. And although obviously Brexit had an impact upon the UK-wide, London relatively, I think, has done better than the rest of the country, although it clearly still remains a huge threat to businesses, and that then can have knock-on effects, of course, on to the overall business rates that we need to collect and support our services.
What do you see the potential impact of business to be?
Perhaps straying away from my key area of competence here, but I mean, clearly the issues that have risen from Brexit in terms of that leading to disruptions of previous trade arrangements have then had impacts upon businesses' ability to generate income, which then affects their profitability, which then ultimately underpins their ability to service bills that we sent out on business rates.
So just looking at the sort of various risks that are talked about in the submission, and just trying to work out how those risks are sort of based and valued, how those decisions are taken, what the sort of extent of the risk is going to be.
Yeah, I think just to add, I mean, I think one of the things that we're very fortunate, I think, in GLA is that although there obviously are risks to business rates, and there obviously are risks, say, from council tax around an impending recession, both those income sources have proven to be remarkably resilient, given the last 2 or 3 years that we've had, which have been very much, stressing those particular income sources. So, despite those issues, our income sources remain very inelastic.
Here's everyone's favourite question this time of year, which is about reassurances around the underestimation of GLA income from business rates and council tax. What reassurance can you give us that there won't be a significant underestimation around that?
Well, as we've discussed at length before, I think the key starting point here is that the worst thing for us to do would be to set out money that we don't have, and that then, as and when that money may not then arise, that then leading to retrenchment and savings cuts that would need to be made in a hasty fashion. And that, I think, is the worst outcome. So, my approach, and I think the approach of the Mayor and his administration, is very much around setting prudent but realistic targets. So going, at risk of repeating our conversation back in September, the assumption that we made overall there was a 4.4% increase in our overall group-wide funding, and that then cascading through to the GLA Mayor. And we still need to await the returns from business rates and council tax from the boroughs that we'll receive in end of January, early February. It's only at that point that we can be clear on exactly what those returns will say for us. But also before then, we are still waiting, obviously, for formal decisions from government. And as I said before, very small changes, what would probably hardly detain a civil servant's pen, can have huge impacts. A 1% change in our business rates is £30 million. So inevitably, there will be a variance between the assumptions that we've made here against what will emerge later on in the process. But as I say, I'm personally committed to formally and informally letting the Assembly know as and when we have firmer, more formal information that can give clarity as to what our final figures will be.
Thank you, David. And I know this is a topic that comes up every year, and you patiently explain it. I guess for context, and I think I'll switch to David Bellamy here, is so that uplift over the past 6 years has been around the £200 million mark every year of extra unexpected revenue coming in or money coming in. Is there a wish list? Is there a sort of list of stuff where you've written down in the office, do you know what, if we get this extra cash, this is what we'd love to do with it?
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning. I think it's a case of being very clear on priorities, which we are in terms of the Mayor's priorities, and that's where our focus is. In terms of the draft GLA Mayor budget before you, given the constrained situation we find ourselves in, really where we were the one place where we were looking for the things that we could spend more, do more, was really related to the cost of living crisis, which obviously is so acute for Londoners right now. And so that was our focus. And then probably in the new year, as we start getting more clarity about some of the things, basically the provisional settlement, which perhaps this is naive optimism, but I hope that this year in the provisional settlement, the government, having set out to businesses what they're doing with business rates and in the inflationary side of that, will be able to do right by us and set out what their policy is there for us. And that's obviously one of the very big variables, and the sooner they can set that out, then the more concrete we can get.
So, David, that's more about sort of the quantum. So the context for people that might be watching at home is the budget process is very, very tight, and we get the figures very, very late in the day, and that's understandable. And because we don't have the figures till quite late in the day, there are assumptions, there are estimations made on what that amount of money that's coming in, and then that's allocated through this draft budget. But then what's happened every year over the last 6 years is that actually we've had more money than we expected, to the tune of just around average £200 million. And then I guess what the committee's been concerned about in the past is that with that money that's turned up, actually there are projects that are then deployed that we didn't know about in the draft process. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying now is I get how difficult it is in terms of the timelines. Let's say for the sake of argument, that it happens again, that there's an extra £200 million, have you got some rough ideas what you might spend it on?
So, I mean, it's really what I say, yeah, we think about this in terms of the Mayor's priorities, but just in terms of the cycle of the budget process for us, because as you know, as the committee knows, money is very tight. The focus kind of through the autumn has to be on each organisation putting its budget together and trying to get it to balance, identify the savings and efficiencies, ensure that they're deliverable, etc. And then, having done that, a process which inevitably involves some compromises, which I'm sure we will touch on for the GLA Mayor budget through the course of this morning, then we can kind of take stock and say, where are we, and what are specific areas where we might feel we're not doing enough, and we might be able to look at that. And so that for me, that's kind of the next stage. But obviously, what I can say to the committee is it's very much about the Mayor's 5 priority areas that we've set out before, and also, of course, the cost of living crisis.
So I'll have one last swing. So, for example, the green bond that appeared last year, which wasn't a part of the budget setting process or part of those discussions, then sort of appeared post the last opportunity the committee had to scrutinise it or question it. So one would presume that there'd been thoughts about how that may be put together before that money was identified for it. But it wouldn't have been in the paperwork because there wouldn't have been any cash allocated to it because it wouldn't have been funded. It was funded out of that money that turned up later in the process. So are there things like that you've got in the cupboard that you think, do you know what, if this extra money comes through, we're going to deploy it? It could be a traffic scheme, it could be an infrastructure scheme, it could be a housing scheme. Is there something that you're thinking about funding should, once again, this extra couple of £100 million turn up towards the end of the process? So,
I mean, I would slightly need to, I'm afraid, dispute the premise of the question. If you take the green bond, we've been saying at this committee and elsewhere for a number of years that the only way we were going to achieve net zero was by significant private sector investment, and that we would be doing more and we would be looking to bring in private sector money. We wouldn't just be looking at the government to write a frankly immense cheque to deal with that situation. And the budget is necessarily a high-level view on things, which then is worked through. I'm sure we'll talk about the green bond later. I know other assembly committees have been talking about that in recent weeks.
The question wasn't necessarily about the green bond. It was more about.
So you take that as an example. So I'm trying to use it back as an example, which is that there is the process that runs through. So yes, there were discussions going on about green, private sector finance and how we might do more about that and bring that in. And where we got to in February was the point of being able to say, okay, we now know enough to be able to say that indicatively we put some money behind this, and then we will work through the details of how to use that in the months ahead. Now, clearly across the group, there are, as you say, a range of things. So TfL, doubtless, would say, oh, if we had more money, we could do more of this, more of that, more of the other. The Metropolitan Police will say the same, etc. And as I say, we will pick up on all those points when we see where we get to in their budget submissions and start, really. So it's for after this stage, kind of through the next couple of months, for us to be looking at that and saying, well, yes, giving suggestions and options to the Mayor about which of those are the priority areas and where more work needs to be done.
So sorry, David, just because I'm mindful of time. So there are a list of things that you would be looking at should that money become available, and it will align to the Mayor's priorities.
There isn't a piece of paper I could wave at you, but absolutely, obviously, it's something that, as we get closer to that time of year, I'm increasingly starting to think about. But as I say, the focus right now has been on getting the draft budgets for each organisation submitted and balanced, and the tough decisions that requires.
Thank you. I'm going to be really mean on time today because we've got lots to get through, so apologies to our guests if I do start sort of asking you to wind up. Richard, you wanted to come in, please.
Briefly, good morning, Chair. I think it is worth saying we have internally within the GLA Mayor budget run the process slightly different this year, because we haven't, in anticipation of a very tight and difficult budget round, run a general invitation for people to come forward with budget bids through the organisation, as it has been done in previous years. So to put some flesh on the bones of David's comments, we're not sitting on a list of projects that we have considered and rejected through a lack of resource this time round in a way that we possibly have in previous years. So because of the tightness of the budget, we're effectively commissioned individual bits of the GLA to come forward with some ideas, which you will see reflected in the growth proposals in this budget. But there isn't a bit of paper hanging around somewhere on a computer with a list of kind of B-list projects that we could fund if only there was a bit more money.
I'm not knocking you for it. I mean, with an extra £200 million every year for the last 6 years, it would be weird not to have a plan. Assembly Member Horani, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, just on a point that we haven't touched on yet, around the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and European funding. So in August this year, the government announced allocations for the Levelling Up funded UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is designed to replace the European Union funding and the Adult Numeracy Programme Multiply. So my question is to David Bellamy, really on this, because the figures represent a significantly lower amount for London over the next 3 years of funding compared to the European Union funding. So how will this impact on the support that this budget offers to Londoners?
Well, that's a question for Phil and Richard, really. Just the point I would make by way of introduction is not only do we have the perennial uncertainty about council tax and business rates income and things like the level of the police grant, but we still don't have confirmation and approval of UK SPF allocations, of what's happening around LEAP funding, etc. And so the uncertainty we have, and that's represented the best we can in the draft budget, really, whatever the government ultimately decides, impacts and delays our ability to deliver.
And also in your answer, could you just give an indication if you have any, if you have been given any indication when you'll get that clarity?
The short answer is no. Soon is what the civil servants in DLUX say to us, but soon is an incredibly stretchy concept in this context. We submitted our investment plan at the very end of July. We were told at that point that investment plans would be either approved or not approved, but we would have a response in October. Clearly, in the context of significant change within Whitehall and within central government, that hasn't happened. We have been reassured that this is about sort of ministerial availability and attention to take decisions rather than any more significant change of plan. But at the moment, it remains a vacuum for us. And there are programmes and there is funding that we hope to get out to boroughs and others that at the moment we're unable to progress with, and we are doing what we can behind the scenes. For example, we expect to sort of put out a heavily caveated sort of prospectus around how we intend to use some of that money for business support reasonably shortly, but caveated on the basis that we are informing the sector so they can start preparations, but there is no guarantee that the money will come through in the way in which we are anticipating. So at the moment we're doing our best to keep this moving as quickly as we can, but in the context of essentially in the context of silence around timing of and potential outcome of the investment plan approval process.
Thank you. We're going to move to the next section now, and I would like to say to members we are on time at the moment, so let's keep it there. And this is the section on the Mayor's budget structure. And Len, you're going to lead off on this.
So, question to Mary.
I think my short answer, Assemblymember Duval, is yes. We have tried to be very transparent in this document. I don't know whether you're asking about the structure specifically, but clearly we've kept to the missions, foundations and core structure, which is actually now for the third budget running, in part to maintain transparency across 3 budgets.
Do you not accept, sorry, I'd give David Bellamy a chance to also comment if he agrees with you. He can just say he agrees.
I do. What I would say is that, the level of detail in the papers, and this is true in the group budget actually as well as the draft GLA mayor budget, has increased in time actually quite significantly compared with practice when I arrived here. Inevitably, it's complicated, and there are always improvements that can be made, and we're receptive to constructive suggestions.
Thank you for the way you've answered that. So in the sense that going back to March 21, when this Budget and Performance Committee, I think, did written submissions to you about levels of transparency and detail, we contend, the committee contends, and its previous participants, that actually we're seeing less and less detail. There were some good reasons for that because of the different challenges we were having at the time. But isn't it a time where maybe we need to have a proper, mature conversation about what detail is required and what transparency is required as you go through on your budget making and budget setting?
As I say, Assembly Member, we're really happy for constructive discussions and suggestions. I have to say that as I read through this document pre-publication, it felt quite detailed to me. But if there's stuff in there that isn't adding value and gets in the way, and then there are other things or other presentations that would be helpful, then that's it's I guess a matter primarily to pick up with finance. But very happy to be supportive of that.
Good. Well, OK, we'll take you up on that offer and we'll come back and we'll build on the issues that we raised with you in March 2021 and to see if we can have a further conversation about that and the issues of transparency. Let's move into structure proper. So in terms of all that gobbledygook between recovery missions, core functions, recovery functions and finance costs, I mean, we've done that. I understand that and those issues, but essentially looking at all the officers that are here today, we're still operating in silos. So you've got this grand scheme where you've got this cross-cutting budget structure that says X, Y, Z with all those different things that I've outlined before, but predominantly we've got a traditional structure. So what's the challenges of that structure in terms of delivering these budgets? And is this changes that have occurred over a period of time really going to work without changing the structure?
So I'll kick off with that. You will all recall that when we moved to missions, foundations and core, we deliberately didn't move to a structural change underneath that. That was very deliberate. I felt at the time that the structure of the organisation was fit for purpose, but that the really important thing was that teams working in different directorates are more clearly focused on a sort of common purpose where the mayor's priorities require that. So Assemblymember Duval, as ever, we are not perfect, but I would contend quite strongly that we and the team represented here today are working in a far more cross-cutting manner than certainly this organisation was when I arrived, and I would say certainly even 2 years ago. And there's a lot of joint working happening explicitly under this missions and foundation structure. I mean, others will be able to talk to the detail more than that. And I think, as we've prepared for this meeting even, and we've prepared to talk to each of the missions and foundations, it is true, I think, in almost every case that more than one executive director has been involved in the preparation of that particular mission or foundation. I mean, that itself gives you an idea that actually these are being delivered by multiple teams working very closely together.
Mary, no one disagrees about cross-cutting work. It's to be applauded. What I'm suggesting here is that there may well be still some traditional approaches going down, and that you're operating probably two different processes is in some ways. And how do you assure me, in terms of transparency and performance, that we're getting the best out of it? And equally, I don't think people should be, and I'm not suggesting, well, maybe I am suggesting, I don't know, right? But hiding behind some of these issues around that are, you know, I'm a great believer in keeping it simple and straightforward, and I'm a bit of a traditionalist when it comes to budget making. That's why I refer to it as gobbledygook sometimes, because I'm not sure when you have matrices within matrices overlapping whatever, that it's very clear about what people need to be doing to deliver a service or to deliver their part of the mission in terms of the GLA or the GLA family. People can hide behind that. That's my principal concern. Yes, and
our job as the corporate management team is to make sure that doesn't happen. I think what I would say is that you know, we have tried hard to keep, you know, two streams of clarity, because you are right. It is more complicated than a straightforward directorate-based budget. I think we work hard to make sure that people, one, are clear how they contribute to the mission or foundation and who else across the organisation they must work with to do that. In fact, not just the organisation, but of course partners as well. So that's the first thing. But we also work very hard to make sure individual teams are very clear what their budgets are and what their responsibility for those budgets are. So a lot of the performance appraisal work that we do behind the scenes, so you in the Assembly see the dashboards by mission and foundation broadly, but we also do a lot of tackling individual teams on their performance as individual teams. You don't see very much of that because we do that behind the scenes, but that happens too.
Okay, thank you very much. Chair, can we pick up the transparency issues that we have made representations on and see how we can follow that up either at future meetings or get some results, hopefully, where we agree about issues of transparency and the type of data or the way that you're presenting information?
That's noted, and there is actually a letter on its way, or has been delivered actually, which touches on those issues.
Good.
Assembly Member Hall, we wanted to come in.
I'll be very quick. Mary, can you confirm then, is it harder or easier to track the results from these various missions, or the performance figures? Is it harder or easier than the situation we had before?
So, in terms of tracking how we're doing against the priorities the Mayor has for London and the priorities that we are working on with partners, I truly believe, Assembly Member Hall, that this makes performance tracking easier.
Easier. So therefore, and takes less time then? This is the point. You said there's an awful lot of work behind it.
Yes.
Is it costing us a hell of a lot more for you to track this efficiently?
No, we haven't. I think that's right. We haven't increased the money we put into our performance tracking as a result of doing this.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. We're going to move into the next section now, which is actually getting into some of these recovery missions. I know colleagues are going to take different sections, but I'll just start off by asking David Bellamy. There's an additional 76 million of ring-fenced funding in the 23-24 budget since the last budget was published in March 22. What's the source of that funding?
It's third parties. I'm just looking at colleagues. There is, I know, in the budget document something that sets that out, and I just don't have it immediately in front of me.
Section F, isn't it? So that's the AEB and the ESF.
So there's that, but there are other things as well. Apologies, I just don't. I mean, do you want to move on and I'll look at it and come back, or if you can?
Chair, should I come in? So if colleagues could turn to table 2.4 in the budget document that sets out the 76 million, Chairman, that you refer to, which, as David says, is driven from external funding, but it also includes two other items there of additional funding as well.
That's the AEB and the ESF, is that right?
So it's AEB, ESF, skills boot camps, skills multiply, GLA's domestic abuse duty, rough sleeping, and then there are a few other items which are as small as amounts.
So this is all government grant?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Okay, and the one-off funding as well, is it?
Well, one never knows with the government, because obviously, there's a spending review cycle. For instance, the domestic abuse money is a new statutory duty, and so there's an expectation that the government will continue to provide funding for that going forward in the future. At some point, perhaps it'll stop being a separate amount and will get rolled into core baseline funding. We don't know, but clearly the domestic abuse as a new statutory duty is going to need to be funded permanently. Particular things on skills, obviously the government may decide to continue with that, or to change course in future. That'd be a matter for them.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process that you go through when prioritising the missions and foundations in terms of the allocation of cash?
That's Richard.
Chair, I'll take this on if that's all right. So for this budget, the process of prioritising the missions and allocations is broadly looking at what we did last year and having in tight financial circumstances, which was our planning assumption, rolling that forward for another financial year and then seeing what was left at the end, and that gives us the kind of £24 million growth figure. As we said in the introduction, this is a relatively light touch change on last year. We think there's a strong argument in the current difficult circumstances for continuity of the GLA's work, and so we didn't, this was not a kind of zero-based budget where we looked at fundamentally at the core budget allocations given to each mission and started from scratch with them.
I've got a sneaky suspicion I may have stood on some of the member clerks' toes here. Apologies about that. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on that to David Bellamy. In the Mayor states in the budget that his emphasis remains on tackling the matters that things that matter most to Londoners. We talked at great length on Thursday about the twin emergencies of air pollution and climate change. And this budget proposes to spend nearly £33.9 million on the Green New Deal mission. What measurable benefits should Londoners expect from this?
That's one for Phil.
I think Londoners will see a broad range of benefits, measurable benefits in terms of improvements in air quality, in terms of reductions in carbon emissions over the period, but also in terms of the way in which funding through the Green New Deal is supporting homes with regard to energy efficiency and insulation, other measures that we're putting in place to provide advice to Londoners and so on around energy efficiency and around energy costs, around some of the support that we are providing to businesses, in order both in terms of and other public sector bodies, both in terms of advice, but also sometimes direct sort of project development support for new forms of energy generation or better insulation and efficiency on their premises. We're also investing heavily in new green space and tree coverage and so on, which is both provides areas for leisure activities and so on, but is also critical in terms of the climate emergency, both in terms of flooding prevention and in terms of cooling effects. So, and this is a very broad programme, and there are economic benefits that flow from it as well. And we're investing in green skills and jobs. So it's a very broad programme. I think there are a wide range of benefits that are associated with it. Clearly, it sits in the context of a much more ambitious target of getting to net zero by 2030, but we have always been clear that that requires action across the system, from central government, from the private sector, from the boroughs and local government, as well as from the GLA itself.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and apologies. Assembly Member Rogers wants to kick off about the adult education budget.
Thank you, Chair. I think these questions are probably best to Tunde. Good morning. Turning to the adult education budget, what are your key deliverables for 23-24 for the adult education budget, please?
Sure. So purely on the adult education budget, we will be funding various providers, FE providers, as well as to provide skills at various levels, skills training at various levels and vocational training. We'll also be funding from the adult education budget local authorities for community learning programs, which are have a focus on skills, but also have a focus on social outcomes and social areas that create greater confidence for Londoners.
Fantastic. And what are your key measures of success? What do you hope to achieve? How many Londoners do you expect to directly benefit from this spend?
So the way the DFE asks us to measure success is looking at how many colleges, how much spend is actually goes out the door and is used by FE colleges. At the moment, we're at 97%, so we are really confident. That's a really good return. In terms of the outcomes for Londoners, we're launching, as you would have seen from the report, the London Learners Survey, and that's a survey that looks at asks Londoners, the people who've benefited from the courses, what the outcomes are, whether it's led into hard outcomes like jobs or promotions if they're already in work, or as well as the social benefits. So in terms of the amount of Londoners we are hoping to reach, sorry, bear with me, let me just have a look at my figures. Can I get? I'll write back to the committee on this.
We don't know how many individual Londoners we're hoping will benefit from this programme.
We do have a figure. I just don't have it to hand, which I'm happy to write back to you.
Okay, yeah, writing to me is fine. So I'm just intrigued by this. So that you take as your measure of success directly as coming from the DFE, which is if you spend the money, it's been successful. Is that?
That's not our measure of success. No, that's how the DFE measure our success.
Has the GLA, as the Mayor's Office, ever thought of bringing in a different measure of success?
Yes, that was the London Learner Survey is what we're piloting.
How long has the AEB been devolved to the Mayor?
Delegated. It's not devolved. It's been for the last 2 years. So I found the figures. It's 200,000 learners.
200,000.
We're hoping to reach.
Thank you. Okay, 200,000, and that's by when? Sorry, you're hoping that 200,000 Londoners are going to benefit?
Every year, every academic year.
Thank you.
I should say.
Okay, moving on then to the next sort of area of this, helping Londoners into good work.
Sure.
What's driving the increase in external funding from sources other than the AEB for this mission, and what will it use to deliver? And also, it drops quite sort of remarkably in future years. So, why isn't that level of funding being sustained?
We've got, in terms of external funding, there's the Skills Boots Camp, which is money that we've got from central government. We've spoken about Multiply as well. That was also allocated to us. I think for the purpose of this budget, as was said earlier, we're not sure what the government's going to do in future years. So that explains most of the drop. We can't plan for it unless it's confirmed.
Okay, thank you. And again, for this mission, what are your sort of performance metrics? How do you measure success?
So for Multiply, this is a program that's based on numeracy. So we're hoping to support up to, sorry, beg your pardon, bear with me.
If it's helpful, Chair, I would direct the Assembly member towards the performance dashboard and the performance indicators section of that, which gives the targets that we set out for this year, with similar targets, I'm sure, for next year.
Thank you. I will look at that. But for the record of this meeting, what are the targets, please?
There are 6 of them, but one of them has 4 subsections. I'm happy to go through all of them if there is time.
I'm looking for what I'm really asking is how many Londoners are directly going to benefit from this mission and this spend? How many people are you hoping to get into good work?
Do you mean directly how many employment outcomes we get
Yes.
out of it? I don't think it'd be exceptionally unwise in the circumstances to set a target about that. I don't think it's difficult. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's impossible to measure it. In truth, we've had many discussions in front of this committee about targets. But at what point do you count a learner outcome coming out of an FE course? How many months afterwards? How many years afterwards? What added value do you count, and do you only count new employment outcomes as a reasonable objective?
Is this is a 253 million spend? Am I correct? And the aim is
across the entirety of the aim.
And the aim is
yes.
to get Londoners into good work. Surely it's not unreasonable to expect you'd be able to measure the number of Londoners who have therefore got into good work.
How do you propose we do that?
You're the experts. You're the experts.
No, and what I'm saying is that's why we've got the London Learners Survey, which gives us the best bet we can at tracking learners beyond their course, and that's why I refer you back to the London Learners Survey.
And and sorry, when is that going to be online?
I'm going to refer that back to Tunde.
So we've launched it this year.
This year?
I believe in September, but I can confirm that to you. We're working with providers now to ensure that they take it up, and we've set some targets on returns that will be linked to performance payments for them. It's worth adding that out of all of the devolved authorities that have an AEB budget, we're the first to launch this. Others are taking our good practice because it's a very good point you've made. We do want to go beyond what the DFE set us as a target and measure success in terms of outcomes.
I'm just mindful of time, so just briefly on the survey, could you just tell me, how's it going to work? Is it going to be monthly, quarterly? How are you going to report this back?
It's once a year, so it's a before and after type survey.
And when will the first survey go out?
The first surveys will go out as some of the courses are all different, but they're going out now. So once someone completes the course, they'll fill in the survey, and that's what we'll use to track their outcomes.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think that's a topic that's piqued members' interest. Assembly Member Duval.
Look, there must be, I think you've alluded to it in the sense that the government set some performance objectives for this money and what the outcomes are. And it's welcomed that the GLA is doing the survey to give added value to that. So we must have a set of performance indicators. What concerns me overall, it's not just on this issue, and I did actually work on a special needs project in another life of where we had very tough targets, to be honest, in a very difficult environment in terms of skills development. But it does seem to me about some of these performance issues that you're testing. And in some ways we need, and it's not beyond wit of the GLA, to come up with a scheme of where you could independent validate your performance targets to say, are they good? It's a bit like an OBR. Instead of budget related, what are you doing and what's your background you're working in? But where you can validate that your performance indicators that you have professionally come up with are the right ones to be hitting in terms of what we should be trying to achieve here in London. It might not, you can talk about your area, but it might be a general thing. How do we validate that we've got it right? That those performance targets we're setting ourselves, even in challenging environments, are the right ones and are stretching us, not ones we can easily achieve.
Shall I pick up the first point that you made? So just relating to AEB, we do have access to DFEs, or limited access, and we're fighting all the time to get better access to the DFEs in the individual learners database. So there is a form of tracking there, but access to it is not easy, and it's something the team are looking at so that we can for the points that you've made. I do think I'm speaking on behalf of my colleagues a little bit, but it's something we discuss as a senior management team, how we can better improve performance tracking, and you'll see that there's some elements in the budget that are very much focused on that. So rest assured, it's a conversation that is continuous with us, because we want to, especially now, prove value for money.
It goes back, Chair. Are we a pacemaker? Are we a leading authority? We are a strategic authority, and we should be leading the way in some of these areas and walking the extra steps. Like our predecessor bodies in the past, the GLC, for all its faults, and it did have some faults, was leading the way in terms of some of these issues and policies, right? And you as professional officers should be leading the way, and the Mayor should be actually wanting you to do some of this. And I think it's the question of whether we've got the appetite or sometimes the capacity to do it, to think differently than maybe some of our colleagues in the rest of our cohort in that sense, not just I know we're individual, but in other local authority settings about these budget processes and performance.
Thank you. Richard, you wanted to come in quickly.
Yeah, just briefly, Chair, if that's okay. So there is a government database called the LEO database, which cross-references the adult funding information that they have with the benefits information that the government have, that tells you all of this information. They haven't shared that information with us, despite us asking repeatedly for it, because that actually is the way in which you find out your job outcomes cost 200,000 individual people, which it would be exceptionally expensive for the GLA to collate individually. In truth, have no mechanism to do that without having access to the universal credit database, which the government has, and actually we for good reason, don't. I have personally asked the Secretary of State for access to that database to provide you with the information. The Mayor has, if the committee wants also to echo that request as well, it's not a party political reason. I think it's stuck with officialdom rather than politicians.
What was the reason for refusal?
Data confidentiality, I believe.
Okay.
Because it does track individuals as opposed to anonymised data, but that information does exist. But in terms then of the GLA echoing that system, starting our own individual tracking system across 200,000 people, that would have enormous resource constraints, as you would appreciate, and therefore we've gone for the learner surveys, the best balance between that and effectively trying to recreate our own universal credit database just for London, which I think would not be a course of action I would recommend to the committee. However, within all of this, what we are doing, I think, to be the policy setting and place setting authority that you talk about, is therefore what we can do with the policy of the money. So I think around some of the policies we're interacting through the AEB, around free jobs for unemployed people, around our expansion of the eligibility of courses to refugees, and a whole range of other things. And I think we are being that leading authority that you want us to be. The reason I think the DFE solely holds us to account on spend is because they have information to the database that they don't choose to share with us, then they don't hold us to account on individual outcomes, because effectively that exposes the data that they have.
Okay, so I see that point, and that's something we'll pick up outside of the meeting. Assemblymember Haran.
I was just going to try and be helpful, because I sit on the economy committee as well, and this precise issue was raised, that the data exists, and if anything, the survey is just a actually shouldn't be required because the data exists as well. If there's a way that we can get it anonymised and sent, and it might be an issue that you cross-reference with the chair of the Economy Committee with, because I think letters may have already gone out from the Economy Committee side.
So I'll pick that up. Thank you. That's a useful intervention. Okay, we're going to move on. We're slightly behind time now, so we're going to hand over to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everybody. My question is for Tim about the robust safety net. So I note that the external funding is up from 1 million to 39 million, and there's a there's a 38% increase on the 22-23 budget allocation for the robust safety net. So what can we expect to see from this increased funding in 23-24? For example, how many people do you think you'll be able to help off the streets in this next budget year?
Thank you. Yeah, and I can talk a bit about the rough sleeping elements of this and domestic abuse. I work really closely with Tunde on this mission on the cost of living elements, which he leads on, and Tunde can talk about that. But in terms of rough sleeping and domestic abuse, the funding levels from last year to this are broadly steady state. They haven't changed. There are some, because of this time last year, we didn't have next year's allocation yet. It looks like that's new money into the budget, but actually if you compare last year's money to this year's money to next year's, it's broadly the same, and we're expecting broadly similar outcomes. So on the rough sleeping side, we are sticking to the same target which we've had, which is 85% of people who access the Life Off the Streets programme being helped exiting rough sleeping. And we're performing well against that target now, and we've got plans in place to do so this winter, and we hope to do that next year too.
Just, I think the latest quarterly report from the Combined Homelessness and Information Network says that the total number of rough sleepers was 3,628 between July and September 2022, which is a 24% increase on the total figure for July to September 2021. Are you expecting numbers to rise further in 23-24?
I'm not sure about further rises. I mean, we're certainly watching the rises this year. We think that is partly to do with some of the cost of living impacts which people are seeing. I think there's a lot going on in the wider world which will drive those numbers as we go forward. So we're not at the moment projecting that rise just to continue and continue. It's been really steep rise actually, 35% increase in flow of new people to the streets over the last period. And we are planning, very seriously planning for this winter's programme to ensure that we can work with those kinds of numbers. And we'll need to continue to watch the data as the months progress and see whether that continues to rise. And if it does, we'll need to continue replanning the service on that basis. But the team's very live to the current issues that are being seen.
So you're confident that within the budget envelope that you've got, that you'll be able to cope with any sort of significant rises in homelessness or that?
I think for this winter, we're putting the plans in place, and we're confident that we can deal with the situation this winter. The numbers increasing does mean that the sector needs to adapt, and actually looking at some of the inflationary pressures that the service is facing, the sector is going to need to adapt. But we think, working really closely with partners, we will be able to sustain the level of service that we've had over this winter. I do think that as we come out of the winter and enter next year, we and government and our partners are going to continue to need to keep a really close eye on this. If numbers continue to go up, and inflation continues to be an issue, then in the future it may not be that the current budget is sufficient, and we will need to look at that. But at the moment, that's not the basis we're planning on. But it's absolutely an ongoing issue for us to keep very closely across.
Thank you. And then the other part of the picture that I wanted to ask about was just how this mission is going to be supporting, and you've slightly touched on this, in terms of Londoners on low income, but also migrant Londoners. Is there anything you can share in particular about your
I
plans
think that's
on
why
that?
I passed over to Tunde.
Thank you.
In terms of migrant Londoners, we know from statistics and from the work that we've been doing with them that they are likely to feel it more than other Londoners. We have set up a targeted migrant information hub, and we have funded organisations to work with them in terms of advocacy, but also in terms to support or to lessen the likelihood of exploitation, particularly in the jobs market.
Thank you. Just moving towards the New Deal for Young People, which is also you, Tunde. What is driving the £9 million reduction in the New Deal for Young People mission for 23-24 compared with 22-23? And what kind of impact is that reduction going to have, particularly on the extent and quality of youth activity that's available?
I'm not sure I recognise the 9 million reduction. Can you show me, direct me to where you're seeing that?
Hang on, just yes, it aims at all young people. Its allocation has been reduced by 9 million or 8% between 2022-3 and 23-4. So this is the GLA-funded element of the New Deal for Young People's mission includes the remaining Young Londoners Fund budget, which aims that all young people in need are entitled to a mentor by 2024, and this allocation has been reduced by 9 million or 8% between 2022-3 and 23-4. Perhaps, Gino, you can point to where to find that in the main budget documents.
Chair, if it's helpful, I can answer the question.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Effectively, because we haven't yet announced our allocation to the Propel scheme, which will be the substitute for that money, and we've always been very clear the Young Londoners Fund was coming to an end and would be replaced by the Collaborative Fund.
Okay, so that's the Propel scheme that we need to look out for.
Yes, which is held in the Young Londoners Fund Reserve, which is substantial in the papers.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent. And then also back to Tunde, how many young people do you aim to provide mentoring for by 2024? And how many have you provided it for to date? And how many do you aim to deliver in this next budget year?
So we are aiming to hit, by 2024, we're aiming to get 100,000 young people, disadvantaged young people, have access to mentoring. Our figure at the moment is 24,000. We forecast by financial year, performance year end, to add another 12,000 to that. The reason we expect in 23-24 for it to get substantially higher, and 24-25 to get substantially higher. What we're concentrating on at the moment is really building up the infrastructure. So we've got our mentoring framework that we've launched and co-designed with sector experts, as well as going to launch a mentoring academy, but working with partners, particularly through the Propel initiative, which is our collaborative fund, to really build up the capacity so that we can really ramp up the figures towards the end of this year and in the next performance year.
Okay, and what about we were talking earlier about sort of measuring the benefits of these kind of programs. So do you have a way of measuring the benefits of the mentoring program?
Sure. So as part of the grants program that we are working with partners, we've embedded in evaluation. Some of it, well, it's worth saying that whenever you make social interventions, and my background was a youth worker. I started off as a youth worker. The benefits take time to measure. You're not going to measure them in a performance year. But having said that, we have embedded in a qualitative evaluation framework, which is based on before and after. How do you feel? Looking at where the young person was on their journey and getting them to self-report how they have felt the benefits of mentoring. And that approach is going to be embedded into the mentoring framework that we are launching.
Thank you. So I now want to move on to look at digital access for all. And I've got a question for Phil. So this is the mission to make sure people have access to good connectivity, digital skills and a device or the support that they need to be online. And there's the point that I'm interested in is the number of public sector sites that have been upgraded in terms of fibre connectivity. It stood after quarter one in 22-23 at 7 sites, and there's a target to achieve 270 sites by the end of 22-23. So when do you anticipate achieving that target?
We anticipate achieving that by the end of this year, by the end of 22-23. It was 7 at the end of quarter one. It was up to 54 by the end of quarter two. I understand it's just above 80 now. But the programme is accelerating because we are both able to draw upon some of the work that the sub-regional coordinators that we fund are doing in South London around broader connections away from the Transport for London network, but critically we are also now have the BAI contract in place with TfL to roll out fibre.
Sorry, BAI?
BAI, I'm afraid I have no idea what it stands for. It's the name of a company who are a sort of a fibre infrastructure company who have the contract to roll out and upgrade the TfL fibre network. And we have been agreeing a delivery plan with them, which is part of the reason the build up to this has been slightly slower than we originally anticipated, but the pace is accelerating, and we still believe we will hit 270 by the end of this year.
Thank you very much. So Phil, another question for you, which is about the Green New Deal. Just big picture, overall, what is going to be delivered by the Green New Deal in 23-24? And in particular, what are the key deliverables and how are you going to be demonstrating the performance? And also, while you're at it, how does that compare to what's going on in the 2022-23 year?
So, I think the really key deliverables in relation to Green New Deal, which will have the largest impact, are going to be around the deployment of the green bond and any subsequent green finance that is brought to us on that basis, where we don't have a target at the moment because we are working through the climate budgeting process to identify the measures that will deliver the greatest impact through that finance, but ensuring that we deploy that and we begin the process of putting those in place both across the GLA estate, the GLA group estate, but also more broadly through our engagement with social housing providers and boroughs will be absolutely critical. Secondly, clearly will be decisions that are taken around air quality and what the impact of those are, and those have a knock-on impact in terms of carbon emissions as well. The Mayor, as you know from the discussion that the Assembly had with the Mayor last week, the Mayor has not yet taken a decision on whether to expand the ultra-low emission zone further, but if ultimately he does choose to go ahead with that policy, then that will be that will have a very significant impact in terms of air quality and carbon emissions. At the moment, a further critical outcome is around home insulation. Beyond what we can achieve through the Green Bond, we are very dependent on what the government's decisions are around the funding they may provide through future rounds of warmer homes or sustainable warmth or whatever the government chooses to call it. We have a target this year set through sustainable warmth to improve the installation of around 3,000 homes across London through our own programmes, as well as providing broader support through our accelerators for social housing providers and so on. We hope that we will be able to build upon that next year, but that depends upon the funding coming through. Alongside that, there are broader measures, as captured within the dashboard, around continuing our work on deploying renewable energy technologies through solar, through our community energy grants, through our work in the planning system around how you build renewable energy into new developments. And we've got a target to have at least 30 megawatts in place by 2024. Similarly, there's a 2024 target around reducing carbon emissions from buildings within London, which all of those other elements play into. That's to reduce those by at least 160,000 tonnes by May 24. And our green space target is to achieve 500 hectares of green space and public realm by December 24. We've got programmes that should deliver a significant part of that have been set up recently and will be delivering over the rest of this year and next year, like Rewild London and like the Green and Climate Resilient Spaces Fund. But there are further rounds that there are further actions that we'll need to take to get all the way towards that.
Mm-hmm. Can I just ask, you mentioned home insulation
yes.
quite early on. Has the death of Awab Ishaq had, after living in an overcrowded home with mould, has that had any bearing on your planning around budgeting for the insulation element of this? Because the Environment Committee did a report keeping out the chill on mould and condensation back in 2018 or 19. And there are ways with active ventilation of reducing the impact of mould in housing projects. We saw a brilliant project at Thamesmead where it had been done, but obviously that needs to be budgeted for. It's relatively low cost, but it would add slightly to the cost of every insulation project that happens, and also there will be a need for retrofitting existing homes in London to reduce. I mean, any of us who are councillors will have a casework load just full of cases of mould. So I just wonder if that has had any impact on your planning around insulation costs.
It hasn't directly fed into our planning immediately, but I would say, while the death of the young boy was tragic, it was part of what was tragic about it is it was not an unknown risk and an unknown factor. So throughout our development of policy around home insulation and so on, we have sought to build upon best practice. And if this is why it's such an important programme. If you can get this right, it has a climate benefit it has a warmer homes benefit in terms of improving energy efficiency, in terms of improving quality of life through that route. It has a climate resilience benefit because actually insulation is as important for keeping homes cool in the summer as warm in the winter. And of course it has health benefits exactly as you have indicated. I think there is that looking forward, I think there is a question which you raised, which we will have to pick up on, which is how, as we think about, for example, the deployment of the Green Bond around social housing retrofit, we can be confident that the projects that we are funding are achieving benefits across all of those three rather than focusing solely on one of them.
And I think the thing that we learnt in the scrutiny that the Environment Committee did was that active ventilation, as well obviously as information for the people living in the homes, but it's the active ventilation that is so often missing and that is contributing to this.
Yes, and I think that is heard loud and clear, and I mean we will be looking at that as we design any programmes going forward. With regard to the government scheme, the sort of the warmer homes and so on, we are very constrained in terms of the kinds of measures that those can deliver, which is one of the challenges around delivering to the kind of constrained timescales that the government has put in place. But with regard to any insulation programmes that we fund or finance ourselves, we will want to look very closely at exactly that kind of issue, and the work of the Environment Committee will be really helpful in that.
Thank you. Sorry.
Richard, do you wanted to come in?
Yes.
Briefly, I mean, Caroline, you and I both know these issues are endemic across London, and I think it's a very important point you made that we try and get something out of this horrible tragedy positive. I think it is right, and I make this overtly not as a party political comment, because the Labour government's Decent Home programmes made exactly the same mistake as well, was that the level of specificity in central government top-down funding programmes for this kind of stuff is actively unhelpful around London's unique housing challenges, or inner cities' unique housing challenges around the nature of the flats that I saw 50 years as a councillor, and I'm sure you and other colleagues who do casework still will. And I think, therefore, there is a degree of devolution that is needed around the design that goes into some of that. And what we are seeing is more specificity in the HUG2 programme, which is the one that's coming up, which is only aimed at properties not attached to the gas network, and therefore will inherently be smaller in London because we have fewer rural properties not on the gas network. The wider point I want to make, though, is one about the GLA's performance next year on the environment, which is the measure you should hold us to is ultimately a qualitative, not a quantitative one, which is there a robust and resilient system in place that can lead us at pace towards net zero by 2030? Because what we as a strategic authority need to do is convene networks of boroughs, housing associations, funders, and a whole range of other kind of key players in all of this sector to get to a system where there is a pipeline of fundable projects being funded that are working at pace through a combination of public and private money. Mm-hmm. And that's actually, and while ultimately that's not a thing you can measure with KPIs, that's actually the most important thing we can do to hit net zero. And that's actually what Phil and I spend more of our time doing than measuring individual tonnes of carbon saved by insulation programmes, where we monitor the performance of them. But again, without meaning to repeat my annual meditation on the philosophy of performance targets, I think that's really the job in hand next year.
Mm-hmm. So a pipeline. Thank you, Chair. I'll give back to you.
Thank you very much, and well done, Phil, for holding the line on the ULEZ decision having not been taken yet. That was very good. Assemblymember Hall.
It hasn't.
Yes, I'm going to be very, very quick, if I could ask for quick answers. David Bellamy, when the Green Bond Scheme suddenly appeared in the budget as if by magic in February, it seemed to many of us to be a spur-of-the-moment decision and not necessarily very well considered policy-wise. Is the slow rollout not proof of that?
No.
No? You don't think? Okay. The Green Bond Scheme represents another significant sum, and as you know, it's nearly 90 million, that the Mayor has had fall into his lap and which he's squirreled away rather than spending on services. So do you think that Londoners hit by the cost of living will take kindly to seeing him maximise his precept increase again if he keeps doing this?
Well, I think that brings in a variety of different issues. The committee is well aware, and we discuss often the difference between one-off income and recurring income. One of the problems that we have with the business rate system is that the possibility of a reset or the possibility of a rebaselining of funding formulas means that it's very hard for the Mayor to look at any additional money that come through business rates as being recurring and thus available for services, whether that be increased police officers, more buses, whatever it may be. So that's one part of it. the other part of it is to remember that we face a climate emergency. And we saw that in London this summer, didn't we, in terms of all the wildfires and the extreme heat that we faced. We saw, as well as the awful hardship for individuals whose homes were affected by that, we also saw the impact it had on service delivery in terms of the immense pressure it put on the fire brigade. And it's clear that we are going to see more of that. And that is just one example of why tackling the climate emergency is so important. And what is clear is that, as I say, I don't say this in a way that's critical of them, the government isn't, the sums are so huge, the government isn't going to write an immense cheque that is just going to solve this problem. It can't. It is going to need to be a combination of public and private funds. And that's absolutely why it's necessary for the Mayor to make some revenue allocation, both to get that pipeline of projects, as Richard and Assemblymember Russell were just talking about, but also so that we can make contributions to ensure that while the sector is not scaled up to the level it should be, these projects can actually deliver, and we can manage any financing costs until the financial benefits of them flow through.
Yes, but the Mayor is quite happy to spend money on from one-off income things when it suits him. And I'll refer you back to the £1,000, the 1,000 police officers on time-limited money. But I know we're very short of time, Chair, so I'll hand it back to you.
That was done on advice from the then CFO that it was reasonable and prudent to spend that amount of business rate income and assume it was recurring.
My point is that the Mayor manages to spend it when he thinks he will. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're going to move on because of time, and we're moving to Assemblymember Rogers.
Thank you. Question for Phil on high streets for all. Could you tell me how many boroughs have a high street strategy as a result of this mission? What demonstrable concrete changes have we seen to London's high streets as a result? And also, what improvements can we expect to see in the budget year? Sorry, microphone.
I'm sorry. Through the High Streets for All Challenge Fund, we have been working with every single one of London's boroughs to ensure that they have on a strategy for one or more high streets within their area. So that work has been going on and has been undertaken. On the back of that, we funded a number of more in-depth, larger scale interventions. I'm just looking for the numbers. I'm afraid I don't have them immediately before me. Hold on a moment. I have found it. No, I'm sorry. I don't have the number of the more in depth, but it's
is it 8 by any chance?
I think 8 is round 3. I think essentially what we have been trying to do through the High Streets Fund is sort of build capacity. So I think all 33 boroughs plus a couple of cross-cutting projects was round 1. I have 17 in my head for round 2, but I'm worried that might not be exactly accurate. And then round 3, which was following on again with some further funding and enabling the more sort of capital works to be undertaken, was I think the third element. But if I've got that wrong, I will write to you and let you know. I mean, the projects themselves are delivering quite substantial benefits in local areas. I mean, there are new community facilities being developed. There are new models being tested. There are retail units are being repurposed for community purposes and other areas. But it is important to say, with a scheme of this scale, this is effectively a piloting program. We are not going to see direct benefit across every part of the capital. So the other part of this that is really important is the toolkits we're developing on the back of it, the High Streets partnership that we have in place, which does involve every London borough, which is sort of sharing the learning from this, and the data platform that we've built that allows boroughs to have, that sort of provides a better value for money way for boroughs to understand patterns of consumption and so on their high streets than they would be able to achieve or doing so on an individual basis.
Thank you. And just so I've got a good idea of how this works, could you just give us a couple of the actual examples of, say, a retail unit coming back into use, a community facility developed as a result of this scheme?
So there's a particular example at Church End in Brent, where a vacant unit has been repurposed to create a youth hub, and where there's money going in to support the street market and develop some sort of workspace facilities in that area. Another example is the project that's underway in Bromley, where they are working with young people in the borough to run youth-led markets along the high street in Bromley, so that young people are able to act as entrepreneurs and build and sort of begin the process of building small businesses. So it's that kind of approach.
Excellent. Good. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Umesh.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't planning to come in, but if I can put this to you, Phil, you said earlier that the projects that are being funded are creating quite substantial benefits. My briefing note tells me that this year the number of jobs created or safeguarded is 59 compared to the full year target of 812. Now, if this figure is accurate, then I don't think it says much, really.
I think I would just make 2 points in respect to that. I think that's with regard to the Good Growth Fund rather than the High Streets for All. But I mean, a similar issue applies across both schemes. I mean, the first is that in terms of how jobs are reported to us, the local authorities who we fund through these programs tend to report outcomes towards the end of the reporting year. So they don't sort of build up on a simple trajectory that goes quite slowly and pushes up. So we're still reasonably confident of achieving the goal or something close to the goal. But I think the more important point is that while there are jobs created through these schemes, and we seek to track those and we seek to understand them, because any impact that you have in terms of employment in London, given the current sort of economic challenges, is important. That has never been the primary goal of either the Good Growth Fund or the High Streets Challenge Fund. I mean, what these funds are really seeking to achieve is to increase and improve the level of community and social infrastructure across London, to ensure that better neighbourhoods are built, to ensure that high streets are thriving and people have opportunities. So they have never been sort of job creation programs primarily. They have been about the facilities that are created, the strategies that we work with boroughs on to try and improve the vitality, the accessibility, the economic sort of prosperity of those high streets and those areas. But there are jobs that come through them, so we do track them, and we do expect to get close to or achieve the numbers this year.
Okay, perhaps if you would give us figures towards the end of the year, I'd be quite interested.
Yes, we'll continue to report through the dashboard.
I mean, all what you said is very laudable and call me old-fashioned, but for me it's about jobs, jobs and jobs. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to the last question of this section, and that's with Caroline Russell around mental health and wellbeing.
Thank you, Chair. So this is for you, Tunde. And there is a plan that by 2025 London will have 250,000 wellbeing ambassadors supporting Londoners where they live, work and play. And right now, with the cost of living crisis, that feels like a very urgent mission. How are you've got 180,000 wellbeing champions. How are you monitoring their activity and checking that their training is effective? And do you have any way of telling us about the impact that those 180,000 wellbeing champions are having on Londoners?
Sure. So It's worth saying that since 2018, we've actually, through our commissioned programmes, actually trained up to 450,000. I think when the mission was set, it was set very quickly, but we've repurposed it to say we're actually going to engage these wellbeing champions. Well, how we're going to do this is we've set up a website. We're developing a website where people who have been trained by us can register. That way we will understand where they are. As part of this database website as well, we will also ensure that opportunities, we can track where they are, where they're going to deliver their benefits, but also give them opportunities within their area to as in places that they can go to practice their craft, as it were. It's worth also noting that we will also be offering booster training to all of them, as well as a thank you. So we're starting that process now, and we're hoping to ensure that we can engage as many as possible.
So, have I understood this? You started off training 450,000 people to deliver this kind of well-being support. Did you actually? Are there 450,000 Londoners who've done the training?
According to our training records, yes.
And so this new website is to try and kind of get hold of some of them to make sure that they're continuing to put their training to good use.
Precisely so. It's that exact point that you made. We know that there's some who are based in schools. We know that there's some who are based in community settings. We now want to get a bit more precise as to where they are to ensure that we can understand the benefits that they're bringing. And
so, are you aiming to track the benefits of all these trained people supporting Londoners' mental health and well-being? Are you planning to track the benefits and the outcomes for Londoners through your relationship with the people who have been trained, or are you planning to also get feedback from Londoners who come into contact with these trained people?
It's possible that we can get feedback. I think it's similar to the point that we made earlier in terms of adult education and tracking. The act of tracking will be substantive expenditure. Yes. What we do have, and this goes to Assembly Member Duval's point, we're working to ensure that we understand from other places what the benefits of health and wellbeing champions are. Mental health first aiders, youth mental health first aiders, so that we can get an indicative understanding of what the benefits will be. So I would imagine, and we're still working through the policy, it will be more likely that as we get to understand where people are and how many people they see, that we can get a proxy measure of the benefits. But to get a precise measure, I think probably wouldn't. It will blow our budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we just take a second to recognise those people sitting in the back there from Tollgate Primary School. Hello. You're all looking very smart and clever and fabulous. And we're having a budget meeting today, which is where these very important people sitting in front of you help the mayor spend £19 billion. Yeah, 19 billion. So we better get on with it. I know. And so the next part, Assembly Member Hall is going to talk about how that money is used to support businesses and jobs. Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. And this is to Phil, please. What is the latest understanding of funding from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund?
The current position is that the government some time ago announced allocations across the country, including an allocation of 144 million to London. That, it's worth saying, that is in addition to the funding for Multiply, which is coming to London, which was top sliced off the overall UK SPF pot. But there is 144 million, which has been allocated to London over 3 years, from 22-23 through to 24-25. That can be spent on programmes across 3 pillars. Community in place, which is effectively more regeneration funding, pride of place, supporting business, and people and skills, which is effectively replacing ESF funding. Though it's important to note that the people and skills element can't begin to spend under the government's rules for the fund until 24-25. So there is no people and skills funding for this year and next year. In order to access that funding, we were required to develop an investment plan, setting out how we intend to use it against a whole range of sub-objectives and sub-indicators that the government provided. As I said to Assembly Member Hirani, we submitted that to the government's deadline at the end of July after a very significant process of co-design with London boroughs and with London councils. It was signed off by both the London council's leaders and by the mayor. We had expected that to be approved, or if not approved, for us to have received feedback over the course of October. That hasn't happened yet, probably for understandable reasons, but in the meantime we are doing what we can behind the scenes to be able to get the money out of the door as quickly as possible once approval is received, or the approval we hope to get comes through.
Okay, thank you. Now, my colleague, Assembly Member Desai, touched on this, but I want to drill into it a bit more. So, how was the 11,100 target for new jobs in the creative industries in 22-23 set? How did you set that, and is it realistic?
My understanding about... Pardon me, if you just give me a moment to find the right page. My understanding is that the target that we set, has been set there, we fund a number, what we call the Creative Industries Growth Portfolio, which provides funding to a number of the umbrella bodies across London that promote the key creative sectors. So we provide money to Film London, to Games London, who support the digital and computer games industry, to London Fashion Week, to the London Design Festival, etc. Through the contracts that we set with those companies, we ask for and we challenge around the stretch targets that they set for themselves around job creation through the funding that we provide, and so that then feeds into the target that we set here. So this is through pushing those organisations to be more ambitious, but equally drawing upon what they have achieved in previous years to give us some confidence that we are setting a target that's appropriately challenging but not unrealistic.
It's not unrealistic. Okay, is it just those companies that you just mentioned, or is there a whole load of them?
I think that is the full set. I think there may be an organisation. I think that's the full set. There may be an organisation in the animation and TV sector as well. I'd have to double check. But of course, they don't generate. The jobs that are generated are not within those organisations themselves. They are the bodies who promote and support the wider industry. So it's through the work that they do to help bring film production into London, to secure orders for London fashion companies, that the jobs are generated.
Okay, where would I go to have a look at the list of places that you give money to? And does it, if it's on a website somewhere, obviously I can look it up myself, and does it say on that website how much money you give them?
It's built into our budget figures. I am not sure. I would have to check. There is an MD each year that agrees this, so there's certainly an MD on the system that would provide that detail. I don't know if we have something on our website that sets it out directly.
Okay, if we can't find it, I'll get back to you.
Okay.
So you think the 11,100 target is achievable?
Yes.
For quarter one, as was mentioned by my colleague, this totalled 895, or just 8% of the full-year target. And yet you think it's achievable?
Well, in the quarter two dashboard, pardon me, we were up to around 3,400. But as is so often the case with these things, the reporting measures against contracts the larger part of them tend to come through towards the end of the reporting year, as the organisations themselves have done their due diligence and become more confident about the numbers that they're providing to you. So in previous years, we have always seen an increase in the number of jobs reported as you get towards the end of the year. So yes, we still believe that we're on target to achieve that.
Okay, and your definition of a new job?
I would have to double check how we count it on this one, but I believe it's an increase. It's additional jobs in the companies that work with the organisations we fund in these sectors.
Okay, and you actually then have got somebody that goes and drills down into that to make sure that it is a new job, do you, or do you just rely? We set it out in the contracts that we agree with them. So we only fund them on the basis of achieving the goals within the contracts. But that's not quite. Does somebody drill down to make sure that's great?
We are in regular engagement with these organisations to make sure that they're delivering what we've asked them to deliver. So yes, we will be asking them for detail.
So you do drill down on it.
Yes.
Okay, fine. I'm moving now to London and Partners. So what level of funding for London and Partners is included in the 23-24 budget?
There is a continuation of the budget from last year on a flat cash basis. There's no inflationary increase built in, so there's roughly 11.1 million for London and Partners as to cover their core costs of doing business and the core programs that they run. Alongside that, we have agreed that we will provide an additional £300,000 to cover the costs of staffing to lead their work on tourism promotion. And we have also identified £2 million to continue international tourism promotion work, so following on from the Let's Do London programmes that have been run over the last 2 years. However, we still need to have a conversation about how that money will be allocated, I would imagine, but I don't know that a proportion of it will go to London and Partners. It could be that all of it will go, but we need to talk about what the best use of that will be and come up with an appropriate plan. But in terms of London Partners' core grant, it's continuing at exactly the same level it was at last year with no inflationary increase.
Okay, well, I mean, we've discussed this before, but you know that the original plan for London and Partners was to become self-sustaining. Is that now dead in the water? Because given the amount of funding that the Mayor continually gives them, is there no requirement for them to start really building up private financing?
We set a target for them each year. Once their budget has been agreed for the amount of additional income that they will bring in from other sources. Pardon me. That was hit very hard over the course of the recession during the pandemic. I mean, I imagine it will, if we are entering another recession, it will continue to be challenging. But I think the bigger picture is that London and Partners have delivered very significantly for London. We look at the return on investment from the money that has funded Let's Do London. We look at the high levels of GVA that they have generated, the large number of jobs that they have generated, and I think you would argue that the Mayor's funding has proved reasonably good value for money. Now, as with any area that the Mayor funds, we would want to maximise the match funding and the funding that we leverage through that. We would want to reduce the direct contribution from London taxpayers to the extent that we can. But I think in a context in which London is facing significant economic challenges, the the additional GVA that London Partners work has created and the additional jobs that they've created is something that we should be continuing to prioritise.
Okay, I think there's always been a debate on just how many jobs they do create. Has an in-house delivery of the same services been considered as a potentially cheaper alternative to the expensive procurement of a PR company?
Yes, and instantly rejected because it would be a daft decision in truth. I mean, we simply don't have the expertise to run that.
That's probably true. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Desai, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, Phil. I do share many of Assemblymember Hall's concerns about London Partners. Ever since I came to this bill to the GLA in 2016, and we were given assurances about self-funding and all that. I think at that time, London Partners only raised about a quarter of their income. Now I understand the pandemic and all the other issues, but we would appreciate some real hard statistics about actual jobs created. What sort of, you talked about GDA figures, so can you please provide, because I don't have anything in front of me right now, so I can't ask you any more sort of questions in details, but I would appreciate sort of really hard information and statistics.
And London Partners assesses its GVA impact and its jobs impact on an annual basis.
Yeah.
And we get, particularly the GVA element of that is independently audited, and the approach that they take is more pessimistic in terms of what their impact is and their direct impact, even than the equivalent bodies funded directly by the government. But I mean, in terms of impact, since 2016. Cumulatively, L&P has added about 1.6 billion GVA to London's economy. They've created or supported about 39,000 jobs, and they've supported over 1,000 overseas companies to relocate in London. So these are material impacts. I take the point about wanting to continually keep the pressure on to ensure that London Partners is bringing in external funding as well as relying on the money that comes from the mayor. But I think the impacts themselves and the benefits that they've delivered are material.
Yeah. I mean, I do get their bulletins, and I appreciate the work that they're doing about trying to attract international businesses. But yeah, okay. So, well, thank you for that. But if there's anything else you can send us sort of in much more detail, I would appreciate it.
I will take that back to the team and see if we can provide you with a fuller report.
Thank you.
Thank you. And after this, I'm going to take Richard out for a coffee and we can have another debate about qualitative versus quantitative analysis. It's always a joy watching you this time of year. I'm going to move on now to talk to Tim, if that's all right, around Crystal Palace National Sports Centre. And I think some of these questions may leak is probably an appropriate word, actually, into the conversations we'll have later around capital allocation. But around the sports centre, the operating budget's transferred from the GLA land and property over to the GLA, and it says in the paperwork that's around some legal reasons and asset management. Can you just expand a little bit on that for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, the main reason for that is the parameters that GLAP needs to operate. The GLAP needs to operate as a commercial enterprise, and Crystal Palace, it's very clear that it needs, at the moment, ongoing subsidy and investment, and so it's appropriate for the GLA to take on that responsibility.
What sort of operating subsidy are we looking at?
Well, this is one of the things which we've been grappling hard with in this budget setting process. The budget until now has been forecast forward as £1.2 million a year for the GLA as an operating subsidy. But that figure is going to need to go up, and that is an area of growth in the budget which has caused some of the pressure on the wider budget that we've seen. The pressures on energy prices, staffing costs, lower income because some of the facilities aren't open, are all causing pressure on the subsidy. But that's really why we're so keen to get on with the renovation as quickly as possible so that we can move to a better position with that over the coming years.
And I know that some of the park was closed down the other week as well. Not the park. David always pulls me up on this. The sports centre. Can you tell us what's the state of the facilities at the moment, and how are we looking at some of them reopening?
Yeah. So I've spent all of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and yesterday working on this because on Friday morning we received a survey which suggested that some of the lighting pillars at the outdoor stadium were unsafe, and we needed to implement exclusion zones around them immediately. So we took steps on Friday to close the sports centre and work with the council to close parts of the park outside the sports centre that were affected. So, you know, that's a live picture. We're working very closely with the council to make sure that there's safety on site. At the same time as working really hard to ensure that we get those lighting pillars taken down as quickly as possible so that the situation can return to where it was before Friday.
And personal thank you for the updates on that as well. They were very useful over the weekend. Lots of people used that facility. So they're really keen to get it up and running as soon as possible. Yeah. Where are we in terms of getting agreements in place to start work on the wider redevelopment of the park?
Yeah,
the sports centre?
Yes. I mean, I think over the past few years, the key priority has been to try and establish a significant capital budget to enable the kind of investment in the facility that it needs. And that was a key step taken in last year's budget, that capital was made available. And so there is now the potential to do the investment in the facility, hopefully get large, important bits of it back open. It's a really complicated renovation project on a complex listed building. It's outside the GLA's usual type of project because we're there directly responsible. There's been really good progress on that. We've gone through a really detailed and complex procurement process to appoint consultants, design and project management consultants that will work with throughout the project to take that detailed design and programming work forward. We've recently appointed a new project director for the project who's really going to lead on that. So I'm hopeful that, you know, beyond this immediate situation that we've got there, the future for the longer term future for the facility looks better. But obviously it's not going to be a quick fix. These projects take time, and we're working really hard on that now.
And we'll come to the capital allocation later, as I said, but I know people will be watching this. A lot of them specifically concerned around the diving pool and the swimming pool. Can you give us a quick update on that so that people know where we are?
Well, the swimming pool and the diving pool have been closed for a couple of years because leaks were discovered, and you know that's the result of maintenance requirements which stem back for decades. And you know, one of the key priorities for the renovation project is to get those pools back open. That's not something that's going to happen within the coming weeks and months. That is a longer term project. But we hope to be able to get the other bits of the facility, the 25-metre pool and the indoor sports arena, the things which have been open up until last week, back open really quite quickly. And you know, as soon as we've got those lighting pillars removed. But the main 50-metre pool and the diving pool, absolute priority. But that is where the main renovation of the facility really needs to focus.
Okay, thank you. Caroline Russell.
Yes, thank you. And I've been contacted by Crystal Palace campaigners who say huge credit to the GLA and to GLL for moving so quickly and working round the clock to make things safe. One of the queries that they have is how quickly are you going to be able to get temporary lights back once you said you were going to get these dangerous lighting columns down? How quickly can you get something back up so that that facility can be used through the winter, because otherwise it's going to be dependent on longer evenings and lighter days. And then the other question is, what kind of transition planning are you doing so that you can, sort of as part of the budget process, because obviously you've got this massive backlog of repairs going back decades. There's obviously the parts that have been working up until very recently, which would be fantastic to be able to get open again. And is that kind of transition piece, so that you've got some good transition planning, part of your budget process for this year's budget?
Yeah. So on temporary lights, obviously first priority is to try and get the existing unsafe pillars down. That is a really complex piece of demolition work. We're on site talking to demolition contractors yesterday, today, to really try and get that project nailed down. But I absolutely agree with you that temporary lights is something that we should be looking at, and that's on our radar. We need to ensure that we're planning in a way that as quickly after the previous lights have come down, we're able to install temporary lights in the location. I understand that is something that we should be, that there are solutions out there that we should be looking at. So we're not into the detail of that yet, but we absolutely know that's where we need to be, because that, despite the fact that the outdoor stadium has got some kind of maintenance issues, it is still in use by lots of people down there. So we really want to try and get that back open as quickly as possible. On the transition planning, it's a similar point really, but we know that the 50-metre pool and the diving pool, they're not going to be open quickly, but there are other parts of the facility which are really being used a lot, and we have to design, and this is a principal part of our planning for the renovation, is to design the programme in such a way that we can keep as much of the facility open for as long as possible. And I think that probably will mean some remedial works which happen early to enable that during the planning period for the major restoration. The last thing we'd want to do, and this is not where we are at all, is a kind of just close down the whole thing and plan then. I mean, we want to keep as much open as possible, do our planning in parallel, and then phase the renovation in a way which keeps as much open as possible throughout.
That'll be very reassuring to people to hear. I've just got one final question, which is, I gather that in the past, particularly while the deep diving pool was open, that there was a considerable revenue from filming, deep underwater filming, and that revenue apparently used to go to the operator rather than to the GLA. And I just wonder whether you're accounting for that within the overall picture of the financing of Crystal Palace, and what your subsidy to it.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've not heard of such a revenue. I'm not sure that it exists at the moment, because clearly we're not going to have the pool's not open until the main renovation's been done. And I know that there were these kind of portholes, these 40 portholes around the main pool, which was an amazing feature of it, and I'm sure that was what was being used for the underwater filming. I mean, it's not a factor at the moment because the pool's closed. I think at the moment we don't know whether we're going to be able to open up those portholes again as part of the renovation or not, and I think that that's something we need to determine as part of the renovation planning work.
If I could add on that, Assembly Member, because I've probably been involved in the project a little bit longer than Tim. So GLL are our operator, and so all the income from use of the site, whether it's filming or whether it's somebody paying and going in for a swim or a hire of a squash court or whatever it might be, would come through to them. And then the contractual arrangement we have with GLL is basically, they get a fair margin for running it, but obviously the amount of income they get then determines the subsidy that we have to put in. And what we've been trying to do in all the work to date, that as part of the business case to make this investment in the facility, is to say, well, right, that it's a sports facility. It's not the same as a borough sports centre, but it has some value very locally, probably in that sense, and it has a much wider value kind of sub-regionally and beyond in terms of things like deep diving pools and kind of facilities that you're not going to get in each borough. And it's about basically saying, well, what are the mix of facilities that we provide, and what are the revenue streams that come with those, because it isn't logical really for the GLA as a strategic authority to be in the business of running a sports centre and providing revenue subsidy to it. And so that's absolutely part of the work about the new thing, is to say, well, right, what are the uses of a sports facility, for instance, climbing is much more popular perhaps than it used to be. Do we need more of that? And it's that sort of thinking, and the right commercial uses as well, to ensure that we minimise the operator subsidy as well as minimising the energy use, which is the key to the business case and cutting the money the GLA has to spend on the operating costs for the centre.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. If I can ask you, Tunde, some questions about the London Borough of Culture programme. So what metrics do you use to measure the success of a London Borough of Culture?
I'm afraid that's me rather than Tunde, as it's delivered by the culture team, which reports to me. Tunde and I work closely together around the Engaging Londoners and the Equalities and Diversity Foundations.
As long as I'll get answers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And essentially, we agree metrics with the boroughs that are successful in securing the London Borough of Culture programme opportunity each year. Those are generally around the numbers of people who engage with it, the number of companies that participate, often around sort of education or sort of youth outcomes as well. And we have carried out some evaluation, which is available on our website, on the back of that, of the first round. But, overall, the outcomes have been quite significant. About 500,000 people were engaged in the Waltham Forest event, either by attending an event or participating in a workshop or so on. For the London Borough of Brent the following year, that actually rose to about 800,000, though because that was right in the middle of COVID, quite a lot of that was online engagement rather than in person. And we look at match funding. The first two programmes leveraged more than 60 million from other programme funders. We look at the number of volunteers involved. There are about 1,500 volunteers. But I think there is, to pick up the point that Richard might make otherwise, there has also been a very important qualitative element to this. And if you were to speak to the former leader of Waltham Forest, Councillor Claire Coghill, she would say it had a broader impact beyond the sort of immediate number of people involved in terms of changing how the borough thought about how cultural programmes could support wider social objectives, and that's been built into their planning going forward, and in particular their work with young people going forward. So I think it has a major sort of cultural impact and qualitative impact, but alongside that we can track very closely the quantitative sort of outputs that it has delivered.
So, at the top of my head, earlier this morning, I actually noted down 5 criteria. I think you met some of those criteria. So, I had people participation, which I think you addressed, in terms of engagement, the diversity of the participation, not just in terms of racial diversity, but women, but class as well, working people, encouraging young talent. I think you answered that. You made that point. The boost to the local economy, again going back to the issue of jobs and also something that cannot be quantified, but again, I think you answered it. You made that point about community cohesion and building that sort of, feel-good factor, bringing people together. And I think you mentioned Brent. Maybe my colleague, Senator Hirani, was a cabinet member, the relevant cabinet member at the time, so he might have a comment to make. But in terms of the London Borough of Culture going forward, what are your plans? Because I understand after Croydon, there is no funding identified to carry the programme.
I'll answer that because it's ultimately a decision for the Mayor. At the moment, there aren't the resources to identify round 3 of the London Borough of Culture. It is one of the tougher decisions involved in this budget round. I think that's regrettable in many ways. I think there's really good products come out of the London Borough of Culture programme so far, and it's the kind of thing we would look to continue if resources allowed in future, but obviously we're not in a position to confirm whether that's the case yet or not.
Chair, I don't know if Asylbema Hirani wants to come in at that point. I've still got some more questions, but I think if you were the cabinet member.
No, you carry on chairing, Commissioner.
No, through, I did say chair, through you, Chair. But I must say that the figures you've given me about people participation are impressive.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it just depends on the mantle the borough takes up to think about legacy and the programme and how it connects with communities as well. I will say from the programme perspective, I think having that ongoing relationship is also important with the GLA. Just looking at the £2 million budget, because it includes money for the fourth plinth as well, how much of it is allocated to the boroughs of culture now, and is it different to previous years?
No, so the allocation for the Borough of Culture is for the Croydon programme for 2023, and there's no further allocation beyond that. I don't believe there's been a change in the fourth plinth allocation, which is relatively small in the grand scheme of things, because it receives a lot of external funding.
Okay, so in our briefing it says £2 million. Is that the current Borough of Culture?
That would be the Lewisham. That would be broadly the Borough of. So forgive me, we can get the precise figures to you, but broadly the Borough of Culture costs about 4 million over 2 programmes, which is funding for bidding, oversight, monitoring, and also subsidies to the boroughs for running their events. So I don't have the figures precisely to hand about what we're budgeting to spend in Croydon on the next round of it, indeed what we spent in Lewisham this year. But that gives you £2 million is broadly about a year and a half run rate of this programme.
I mean, my memory is we give about 1.3 million to each of the boroughs who do it. So if you're looking at sort of 4 million to do another 2 rounds, that would cover 2 boroughs, 2 London Borough of Culture, the 2 boroughs, but also we run what we call the Cultural Impact Awards. So when we run the bidding rounds, there will be 2 boroughs who get the full London Borough of Culture sort of package, for want of a better word, but also smaller grants of about £200,000 from memory to a number of the other bidders to develop their proposals in more detail and to think about how they can deliver smaller elements of them even without having been the successful bidders for the Borough of Culture itself. And then of course there are administrative costs associated with that as well. We have allocated about 100,000 this year in this budget just to cover the costs of some of the preparatory work, so that if it does become possible to go ahead in future, we can still hit the timescales. But we are being very cautious about how we use that money, and hopefully will not need all of it if the decision is not to go ahead.
Okay, no, that's helpful. You've answered maybe one of my other questions was about whether so in the past, obviously, the boroughs that were unsuccessful were given some funding for smaller projects as well. So is that due to continue as well, regardless of the wider Borough of Culture question?
Well, I mean, we would undoubtedly have to look at how much money could be made available. We have looked at what the costs of running a full London Borough of Culture programme, as we have done so before, would be, and that would be about 4 million over the period to 2028. If the answer isn't there's no money or there's 4 million, but there is, I don't know, 2.5, then we'd look very carefully at what we could afford with that and try and get the best value out of it. And that might mean changing the nature of how the programme is run and so on. But at the moment, there's no money in the budget, and unless something changes over the remainder of this year, I think that may be the difficult decision that we have to take.
Yes, Chair, just a couple more questions. So in terms of Croydon, you are right, it is £1.3 million because I've checked their website. But understand that they're getting the additional £100,000. How have the costs for Croydon been reprofiled, and what will be the benefit of this additional £100,000?
I think the additional £100,000 in the budget is the money I was talking about for to just do some of the early preparatory work, okay, so we can still run another round. The money for Croydon has been reprofiled a little bit through some of the discussions with the borough, but that is now built into these sums. That's not a reprofiling through this budget.
Right. So It's not for anything, any new activities?
No.
Or, no.
No, but we've done a lot of work with the London Borough of Croydon on the back of some of the financial challenges that they have faced to make sure that they can still deliver, and that has changed some of the dates a little bit, but the programme is still going ahead and they are as committed as ever.
And I think it is worth saying the Mayor would like to put on record his thanks to the new administration in Croydon for working so collaboratively on the project.
Okay. Just coming back to your staffing costs. So what are the staffing costs for the Borough of Culture? And how much support do you give to boroughs prior to the year and during the year? I mean, you've given us some idea, but...
I don't have an exact cost for the staffing. I think I could easily get one for you and write to you, but there's a team of about 4 or 5 people who support the London Borough of Culture when it is at its biggest, when we have bidding rounds going on or when we have programmes being delivered. There's quite a significant programme management element to it. There is a significant monitoring and evaluation element to it, and the process of running a bidding round is quite substantial as well. So it's not a huge team. I mean, the vast majority of the work is done by the boroughs themselves, but it does create, there is a requirement for us to staff it and to run it properly, and that feeds into having enough support and having people with the right skills to engage in those discussions with boroughs like Croydon, who need to think carefully about how they can still deliver the outputs that they want to.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, it is frustrating when you've got a project which is well received and has good outputs, and there isn't the funding available. And Tim said earlier that unless something happens this year, then it won't potentially not go ahead. But luckily enough, as we started the meeting talking about, for the last 6 years, £200 million-ish has sprung up in the last few months of the budget setting process. So is this an example of something that might be on a wish list if that money does become available?
Well, it's certainly a possibility.
Okay, so there is a list.
Well, there isn't a list, but I certainly, as I say, the things like this that fell out of the GLA budget and came to an end through this tough budgeting round, clearly those things that we will consider.
And just trying to be helpful. If £200 million becomes available, then and it's not allocated to anything, then there should be space for 4, shouldn't there? Okay. Moving on to Susan Hall, Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Chair, I must say, I think if you're looking at budgets and every year you've had 200k at the end of the year, do we not think you should have a list so that you do know if miraculously 200 million just becomes available, that you'll know exactly what you would do with it, or a figure along that line? And you're bearing in mind this has happened for so many years running.
As I said earlier, Chair, the process is that the focus at this stage is on getting the budgets for the GLA and the functional bodies to balance, and understanding what the compromises and things that we can't do that the Mayor might like to do within those are. And then having done that, then we start moving on to looking at ideas should additional funding become available, doing that in parallel with the process as we get more clarity about our financial position.
Thank you, Mr. Bellamy. I hear what you say. Right, we're now going on to equality, diversity and inclusion. So that's to you, Tunde. How are you monitoring the impact and effectiveness of the Mayor's Commission on Diversity in the public realm?
I'm afraid that one's for Phil.
I'm afraid that's back to me again, as it's another programme within the culture team. We are looking at the outcomes, the outputs that are delivered through the grant programmes, and the funding for new commissions that is provided through the Commission for Diversity. We have based a lot of the Commission's work around community engagement. So we have been trying to ensure that we are targeting the types of intervention that communities would value in terms of increasing the diversity of the public realm. And we're going to be, as with any programme that we deliver, we will be monitoring the spend to make sure the outputs that have been contracted are delivered. And
So quite a few things have been going on.
Yes, we have provided £533,000 in grants through the Untold Stories programme to 19, I think, community level projects. Those have included work on sort of oral histories and stories around Walthamstow Market, around new heritage information boards in Chinatown, around some walking tours celebrating London's Jewish communities. So there is a kind of community level aspect of this, and we will be running a second round of the Untold Stories grants later this year. There is funding of 750,000 of the funding for the commission is earmarked for what we're calling emblematic projects. So the sort of the larger commissions for new public works within London, and there has been a programme of community engagement running alongside that. I mean, very little of the funding that is earmarked as being for the Commission for Diversity is directly funding the Commission's meetings and so on itself. It's all about funding the development of new projects within the public realm.
Well, you mentioned the Commission's meetings. The Commission hasn't published a note of its meetings since July 2021. Has it not met since, or is this an administrative oversight? I mean, would you agree it's not terribly impressive if it's the former, and it's certainly not transparent if it's the latter?
I don't know. I will have to go and check that.
So surely somebody would have checked that, knowing this is the sort of question we always ask. Well, I particularly always ask. In this instance, I haven't checked it. I've spoken to my team about the work of the Commission in terms of the grants that we give and so on. I haven't checked when the last meeting of the Commission was, and I will have to do so. I'm sorry. Right. Will you put it in writing to us, please?
Yes.
And if they haven't met, then that's well. Let's see what answer you get back, or we get back, if that could come to us quite quickly, please. Why does funding for the Commission end at 24-25?
Because it was always intended to be a time-limited programme. It was set up to kickstart debate around this, to provide some funding to community groups as described, but it was never intended to be a permanent part of the sort of the GLA architecture in this area.
Okay, so what does the Mayor hope the Commission will have achieved by the time it's seemingly wound up?
But what it's already achieved, which is a quantification of the massive underrepresentativeness of the representation of minority groups in London's public realm, where we've already seen data that the Commission has run showing that of the hundreds, if not thousands, of sculptures of public figures in London, only 50 of them are women, and only 3 of them are to named Black, Asian and minority ethnic women. That doesn't speak to London as it stands, and the aim is to try to correct to correct that by by putting in place new emblematic projects that celebrate key elements of our cultural heritage, and also these smaller projects as well.
Okay, so if you're doing that, then do you assume it's gone through the Commission, or is it being done completely separately? I'm trying to establish whether they ever meet. So does if you're going to put up new statues, do they go through the actual Commission? Do they go through?
To be honest, I'm not an expert on the processes involved. But yes,
my understanding is members of the Commission have been involved in the decision making around the provision of these grants. Members of the Commission are involved in discussions around what projects the emblematic Commission's funding should be provided to. Members of the Commission have helped set the sort of the scope and the objectives for some of the research work that Richard refers to. So they have been closely involved. I don't know, as I said, how recently they have met as a whole body, but we engage with the individual members of the Commission to make sure that they are guiding the work in this area.
Okay, well, since it's 18 months ago since we can read anything, perhaps you could also, if they have met, forward us notes of those particular meetings. The budget submission, which is on paragraph 5.11, states that the GLA plans to spend £1.4 million on an awareness campaign in relation to the Elections Act 2022, specifically regarding voter ID. So is this a campaign the GLA is required to run?
Thank you for that. That one is for me. The GLA does have a statutory duty to raise awareness and ensure Londoners are made aware of issues of importance. And there has been agreement in the past. My understanding, sorry, because of my newness, but my understanding is there's been agreement in the past for apolitical campaigns to run, like London voter registration campaigns.
But are you required to run? This is 1.4 million. Are you required to do it?
No. Well, it's worth pointing out that the 1.4 million is up to 1.4 million.
Are you required to do it?
Are we required to do it? I'll need to check and get back to you.
Mary will know. I suggest we aren't, but Mary will know for sure. Are we required to do it?
My understanding is we're not required to do exactly this campaign that we are planning to do. There's a statutory duty around awareness, but the requirement to do this campaign on ID, I don't think we are required so specifically to do this.
Okay, so we're not required to spend that 1.4 million. Why is it considered, to go back to you, Tunde, why is it this considered a priority when the Electoral Commission will be running its own awareness campaign?
So at this moment in time, we are not aware of the contents of the awareness raising campaign that the Electoral Commission is going to run. We are unsure on whether their communication will meet the diverse needs of Londoners. So therefore, we thought it would be prudent to set aside this budget in order to assess what they are planning to do, and then, if need be, improve that to ensure that it hits, it reaches Londoners. We know that that Bromley, for example, ran a voter ID pilot, and that decreased the amount of people who registered to vote. So we feel as it's important, I guess, for democracy within London and for Londoners, that Londoners know what is needed and are assisted to register to vote.
So the Electoral Commission, whilst running its own campaign, you think they might not get that right in London?
We want to assess and support whatever campaign that they do. As I said earlier, the budget has been put aside to help us to do that.
So where did this idea originate from for this campaign? Was it the mayor or was it officer-led?
We run a voter ID registration. We run a campaign every year, which is apolitical, which you'll know, Assembly members will know. It involves the Assembly and the Mayor.
I'm just asking where this particular one came from.
It came from officers scanning the horizon and saying, actually, we need to do something different this year because the election rules have changed, and offering that advice to both Assembly and to the Mayor.
So what is the purpose of the campaign? Which sections of London's population is it intended to reach most?
Sorry, 1 second. So I beg your pardon, I did have statistics in front of me. I can, oh, in fact, here they are. So we know 61% of Londoners are not aware from our YouGov polling. Black Londoners, 30%, other mixed Londoners, 27% are less aware. We know Londoners born in the EU are slightly less likely to be aware than those born in the UK. We know Londoners on lower household incomes, particularly those under 20k, are less aware. 1 in 10 Londoners, 11%, do not hold a form of approved photo ID, and close to 1 in 5 Londoners aged under 25 say that they do not hold an approved ID. And I think that will be the basis that officers will be looking at and assessing the Electoral Commission's communications.
Well, I'm not sure if you're aware of the research that was published by the House of Commons Library last week, which actually showed that the groups least likely to have relevant IDs are the over 85s, people with disability, the unemployed, those without formal qualifications, and those of white ethnicity. And that was published last week, so you might point them in that direction if indeed this £1.4 million is deemed to be necessary to be spent.
Thank you.
I mean, how much of this funding is expected to go to community grants and how much to awareness or publicity work?
The community grants, forgive me, I have a figure of 340,000.
Really?
But I will write. I'm happy to write back with the exact number.
Right. And how does this expenditure on this particular campaign compare with other equivalent awareness exercises?
In terms of voter registration or generally?
Well, compare equivalent awareness exercises. How does this compare?
I'm happy to get those figures to you. Are we talking? There's.
Well, I mean, this is £1.4 million of taxpayers' money that you do not have to spend. Our job is to scrutinise you and find out why you're spending it, especially when you don't have to. Especially when Richard Watts started the meeting saying a particularly tight and difficult budget round. And I've just found here £1.4 million that you do not have to spend. And clearly some of the people that are less likely to have ID aren't on your list. So I'm just concerned that £1.4 million is spent. So how much would you normally spend on a campaign such as this?
Well, we haven't had a campaign such as this because the Elections Act hasn't existed before then. However, I just need to emphasise it's up to 1.4, depending on what we see coming out.
It's an extraordinary amount of money when actually there's another body that will be doing this work and we do not have to spend it. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much. It would be interesting to see what the Electoral Commission suggest when they do start their campaign. Just to note with Bromley, because I didn't want people to think that it was a massive disaster. There was 100,000 people voted. About 570, I think, arrived without voter ID. Of them, 415 returned with the suitable ID. So, just to put that into context.
I will double check my notes. Thank you.
Marvellous. So we're going to move to transport and infrastructure. Caroline Pidgeon, you wanted to ask a question here.
A quick question here to you, Phil. What are the plans for funding the Mayor's Infrastructure Coordination Group after June 2023, which I think is when funding you've got runs out, and what would be the impact if you failed to secure any funding in terms of service delivery?
And historically, it's been entirely externally funded, and we have been working with particularly the team within TfL who manage their lane rental income pot, which is the route through which the majority of the funding for this service has come in the past. TfL don't just hand out that money themselves. There is a steering committee made up of the utilities and others who provide the funding into that pot to make sure that the funding is meeting their needs. So we've been working with the lane rental team. They are very happy with the success of the service, and they are keen to increase the sums that may be put through. But there is in fact, I've probably just overstepped the mark, because there are a set of governance processes that they need to work through. But similarly, it has been endorsed by the Mayor's London Infrastructure Group, which comprises the CEOs of most of those utilities, amongst others. Alongside that, we are introducing a subscription service for developers, and we're seeing the first subscriptions come through to that, which we tried running the sort of what we call the development service, which is providing a sort of middleman, a convening function between the utilities and the regulators and developers, to try and make sure that infrastructure is brought in at the right time as on a kind of cost recovery model. And it didn't work. The developers, in particular, who we were looking to recover funds from through this, found it difficult to budget on a model of that kind, where there's been much more interest in running it on a subscription basis, and we've got the first couple of developers signed up to that, and interest from others. We're also looking at how we might, what contribution, and whether there might be scope for boroughs to support as well. However, I think it is fair to say that, which is reflected in the budget document, there is an increasing view that the GLA itself, in terms of its wider responsibilities for London, is a beneficiary from this service as well. And if the GLA is to be asking external parties to be supporting it very considerably, it should be making a contribution itself. And so that has been built into this budget as well. There's £500,000 a year on the GLA side to support it, but that will be the minor proportion of the funding, compared in particular to the lane rental funding and others. So it's not signed, sealed and delivered yet. I have perhaps overstepped the mark slightly, but we are confident that the funding will come through and we'll be able to expand the service over the coming years.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, we're ready to move on to the next section, but I will let colleagues know that we're running about 15 minutes over time at the moment, so just be mindful of that as we move into the next section, and it's core functions with Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Mary, if I can start with you, please. What was the impact of the grading reviews in the Mayor's Office and Legal referred to in the budget submission, and how do these align with the GLA's pay and reward review?
Thank you. So these gradings, all gradings we do at the moment, are, to answer the second question first, are in advance of the outcome of our pay and reward review. So we're consulting on that at the moment, but we continue to look at the grading of existing posts, because that's our current system. So that, I hope, answers the second part of the question. In terms of the regrading in the Mayor's Office, I mean, David can talk to the detail, but that was related to some changes to roles. On the regrading in the legal services, which is the TfL, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask David Gallie to speak to, because that's TfL business that's then impacting our costs.
Yeah. On the Mayor's Office, what you see in terms of the increased Mayor's Office budget is two things, really. Firstly, it's the annual increment that people get under the existing pay and grading system that we've assumed throughout the budget. So that's entirely normal. And then the other thing relate to things that were done, again, through standard GLA processes, in terms of when we did the Mayor's Office restructure in kind of summer into autumn 2021. Through that, a number of people asked for challenged the proposals, asked for regrading, and that did result in some regradings. That was obviously done through the independent process that HR arranged with independent members of staff. It wasn't something, for instance, that I was personally involved in. You're seeing that as an increase in the budget this year because there was an error and it was omitted from the budget last year. But in terms of what we're actually spending there, there's no change there. The change is just the annual increments to people's salary, as will happen in every part of the GLA.
And Assemblymember Hall, just to answer the question about legal. So TfL Legal had a number of very difficult issues in terms of recruitment and retention of their lawyers. and that triggered them to then produce an independent benchmarking review, which then increased some of their salaries. And as part of the shared service, then we are bearing our share of those additional costs to ensure we have a adequate legal function that can support the GLA.
Okay, so either Mary or David Bellamy. So were there in-year grading reviews? So people were upgraded within the year?
So, so you're showing the Mayor's office?
Yes, I am.
In the Mayor's office, the restructure took place in summer or 2021. I remember many colleagues here were on the Oversight Committee and we discussed the draft proposal there. As is normal through that process, a number of colleagues gave feedback, and Unison gave feedback, and then as job descriptions were finalised, they were then graded through the independent process to determine what they were. Since then, I think I'm right in saying I don't believe we have done any kind of formal reviews of job descriptions. There have been one or two periods of acting up responsibilities when we've had vacancies and so forth, but in terms of the kind of standard job descriptions, I believe I'm right in saying that none of them have changed since then.
So if they were regraded in this year, does that contribute to the Mayor's office budget getting an uplift?
So the regrade happened in the 21-22 financial year,
so
but because of when it happened, it got missed from the budget for 22-23, so we've been spending it, it just hasn't shown in the budget. So a significant part of the increase in the Mayor's office budget is not that we're spending more money, it's just that the budget is more accurate.
Okay. What process did the Mayor's office have to go through to request the additional 300,000 in this budget submission?
Well, what this shows no increase in activity in the Mayor's office, no changes to headcount or grades or anything like that. It is purely a reflection of previously agreed decisions about Mayor's office staffing that were incorrectly budgeted in the past, and secondly, the standard GLA policy in terms of increments for paid service staff. And so there was no specific process there because that is just standard corporate policy that the finance team would apply.
Okay. You also in the budget submission 4.18 refer to allowances have contributed to the uplift. What are you referring to there?
Absolutely. The Mayor's office isn't a 9 to 5:30 organisation, and what we have to do is ensure that cover is available at all times. And so in accordance with corporate policy, there are a series of allowances that are paid to colleagues where they work significantly out of hours, or covers others' responsibilities out of hours when they're not working.
Okay, so that's other salaries.
So it's allowances in accordance with GLA policy for colleagues who work very long hours at antisocial times.
Is that same luxury afforded to the other directorates?
It's standard policy. So, for instance, Mary may want to say more, but for instance, press officers who are on call through the weekend would receive an allowance.
Okay. Mary, what will the 20% increase in the cost of the corporate management team deliver in 23-24, and what is the investment in training that will be delivered and at what cost?
Thank you, Assembly Member Hall. So we lay out in 4.19 broadly what is driving that. We are, Assembly members, many Assembly members here will know about the new planned monitoring officer arrangements, which is a dedicated half-time FTE plus administrative support. So that is part of what's driving the increase. And then, particularly in Niran's area, we want to bring in a new Assistant Director for Strategic Partnerships, which I think Niran can speak to in more detail if you want more detail. But also, we are investing in two programme offices in Tunde's directorate and in Niran's directorate. And in fact, Tunde referred to this right back at the beginning when we were talking about performance management and having a real grip on what we're delivering as an organisation. And as senior leaders in the organisation, we have very little direct support to ourselves. As you know, we share personal assistance support 2-to-1, and it's become clear that particularly in Niran and Tunde's directorate, there's not enough support to them in managing huge breadths of agendas, as we all get a sense of at these meetings. So there is a small investment in small programme office teams there.
Okay, we haven't got the time to go into that, and I'm sorry about that. But perhaps you could put it in writing to us, because the submission, which is in paragraph 4.19, refers to a 700,000 implementation cost of the GLA's new EDI strategy. So if you could put that in writing to us, it will save some time, and we'll be able to look into it. Thank you. Mary, what is the current expectation for the level of savings from the relocation of City Hall?
At the moment, we have not changed our view on the relocation savings, and so those remain in this draft budget as they have always been. But we are still not quite at the agreement to the final account with the contractor, the relocation contractor. So as some of you will know, there's still a little bit of work being done around the building on various things. But I am very hopeful we will reach the final account with ISG next month in December. And so we'll be able to bring a sort of a full account of the relocation, its costs and its savings, to, I think I'm coming to the Oversight Committee in March, but that will all be laid out in our final budget.
Okay, well, we'll all be thrilled to hear that everything that we're complained about will be fixed within the month. I feel I might be asking you about that again, Mary. The budget submission contains a nearly 600,000 City Hall relocation cost, 600,000 in 23-24, which wasn't in the budget last year. So what is that for? Is that even more? It's paragraph 5.3 in the budget submission.
5.3 is something different. 5.3 is about engaging Londoners and the recovery programme.
In the budget submission?
Yeah.
Oh, unless it's referring to my notes here. Well, unfortunately, then I'm going to have to... you don't recognise that?
No, I don't recognise that, Assembly Member Hall.
It's 5.3 in the capital strategy.
Oh, it's capital
Page
strategy.
67. Thank you. Nearly 600. 576,000. Thank you.
David or Mary might want to add more, but I'm assuming that it's the fact in the building you have to spend money on your capital asset to maintain it. If you don't, you end up in the situation that
It's
we're
over
ending up
half a
in
million.
Crystal Palace.
I'm surprised you weren't aware of it.
Well,
quite honestly.
I was completely in the revenue budget. I hadn't.
Well, we're talking about City Hall.
Ongoing maintenance over several years, I think, is the answer to the question. So it's less. It's not really relocation. It's about ongoing.
Over 500,000. Yeah. Oh, and there's already $1 million in there for City Hall infrastructure. Okay, but I'm sure we'll come back to this another time, Chairman.
Assembly Member Hall, if I can just be clear. So there's two costs here. One is City Hall infrastructure going forward, capital costs of maintaining this building going into the future, in fact, for many years in the capital strategy. And then, of course, there are costs related to Trafalgar and Parliament Square. But I'm happy to answer further questions in a different forum.
We'll delve into that, I have no doubt, going forward. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Assembly Member Pigeon.
don't think you will be settling with the contractor by next month, given I've been told January at the earliest I can expect a door that actually locks properly for my office, because they've had to order another new frame, so on our third set of doors. So I think there's probably quite a lot still to do, to be fair. I wanted to pick up the issue of the HR shared service transformation. What is the anticipated level of savings, please?
As I've said from the very beginning, that the transfer of some of our services to Transport for London and the sort of building back of our strategic function, because we're doing both of those things, are in the first instance going to provide us with a much better service than we have had for the last 3 or 4 years, or indeed before that. And we're focusing on making sure that we've got a high quality, resilient service right across strategic advice, recruitment, payroll, everything else. And in the first instance, and possibly for the next 2 to 3 years, we will see little in savings from that. Partly because we're having to build back in resource that we had taken the wrong decision about before and taken out, and partly because we're having to build in systems costs for new systems, which are absolutely the right systems going forward, but are systems that we don't have at the moment. So, the long and the short of it, and I've said this to Oversight previously, is that this is about moving to a high-quality service that allows us all to have some of this stuff operate in the background without any fuss. We do, however, over time, expect to move to a lower-cost service on the shared service side, because we will be benefiting from the scale that TfL brings. And again, as I've spoken to the Oversight Committee before, we know that the cost per head of those services in TfL is significantly lower than the cost per head of the services currently in the GLA. But I think, right now, Assembly Pigeon, it's hard to give an accurate answer to your question, because we're right in the middle of the transfer. We are recognising, I think, that getting this transfer right is going to involve keeping probably more resource on the GLA side for a bit longer than we had thought. But we're absolutely clear, and so are our TfL partners, that this will, over time, produce us savings in our HR service. But we've looked at quite a long payback period for our investment from the beginning. Okay. But I probably need another 6 to 8 weeks probably to get us through where we are now, and we'll be able to step back and provide some more accurate detail on the sort of the next phase of our shared service.
Okay, because that would be useful. I recall you coming to Oversight in September 2021 and being pushed on this, and you had said there was anticipated a cost saving from the transfer. Moving towards a shared service for transactional HR will save the GLA money. But when we look in this budget this year, there's a 39% increase in HR costs from 3.6 million to 5 million. Is that because the point you made, you're retaining additional HR? Is it because you're having to put more in on the other side of HR that isn't transferring?
Well, it's a number of things, and you're absolutely right to point that out. It doesn't, it seems as if one hand's not knowing what the other one is doing. We've, I hardly dare mention the word recruitment in this forum, but we have been shoring up our recruitment service significantly over the last year, and we're going to continue to do that until we know it's back absolutely where it needs to be. So that's the first thing. We have also got, as I said, some transition systems costs that we probably underestimated earlier on, if I'm honest, and actually nested in here as well, which Assembly Member Hall has referred to, is we are going to put some more dedicated resource into equality, diversity and inclusion, as recommended directly from by the Equal Group's independent review.
Okay, so you said you need probably 6 to 8 weeks more to really be able to oversee this. Will you be able to write to us setting out when you expect the savings to be delivered in which years, and give us more of a flavour of this so that we can scrutinise it?
I definitely will be able to give you more of a flavour.
Great.
But I suspect I'll be talking about this to some of you for some months to come.
Okay, and then what are you learning from this HR transition that's going to be applied to the transfer of IT transactional services to TfL?
So that's a very good question. I think, again, you know, we only cut across on the 31st of October. So we're 3 weeks in. We've got the first payroll on Monday, 28th of November. I think these transfers, planning, ramping up to them, cutting across, dealing with the pressures immediately afterwards, it's a huge deal. I would say that that's my biggest learning. It's been a huge deal for us on this side. It's been a huge deal for the TfL team, for whom we have had the most marvellous support. I guess my lesson is we cannot overestimate the scale of these transfers. And so I think for me at the moment, that is the biggest learning as we begin to put some more detail around the proposed IT transfer. I mean, the IT transfer will be entirely different to the HR transfer. But the other thing that we will do, and again, we've agreed this as a team, as a project team, after Christmas we'll move into a proper lessons learned phase, and then, you know, we can make sure that those apply directly to the IT transfer. And we've got many of the same people, particularly on the TfL side, supporting us with the plans for that. So I'm confident that there will be good learning that is then held for the IT transfer.
And throughout that, you'll then be able to quantify the savings as well that you anticipate from the IT transfer. Okay, yes. That's helpful. And then to you, David Gallie, how is the anticipated level of inflation reflected in the core functions?
I mean, the major item, of course, is the provision for the pay award, where we've increased the 2% provision to 5%. So just that covers off the staffing element. There are explicit areas such as events, which perhaps Niran will talk to more detail at a later point, where we've recognised that to provide an adequate events function, we need to reflect inflation. But as I said at the beginning, particularly say on the capital programme, where we have effectively external funding that's cash limited, we're in a regime of rationing, which I think does have then real implications for the delivery of the housing programme. So there is a differentiated approach between staffing, non-staffing, revenue and capital, but also looking to reflect where necessary, where we've had to increase inflation on non-staff, we have done so, but in only very limited circumstances. So again, we're waiting, for instance, for the energy contract to be finalised on this building. For instance, we'll look at the energy hike that we're expecting from energy prices going up, so there's further work to be done there. But it's been a very selective process about how we've applied inflation.
Niran, do you want to just comment on events? Because obviously that's a big area. And
yeah, absolutely, really happy to. So what we have done is we've requested £345,000 in next year's budget to cover inflationary costs, costs related also to supply chains and our ability to be able to get the right number of stewards in to ensure that we run safe events. This is very much based on kind of what we know now, as well as kind of what we're projecting in the future. So already this year we have overspent in our events budget by 145k. We have absorbed that cost, but those are related to additional costs that that are related to both inflation, as I said, and supply costs as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to hear from you, Niran. I was a bit worried there.
I am still awake.
I'm very mindful of the fact that we're very close to the 1 o'clock what I was hoping for to be the cut-off point. So what I'm suggesting is that we take the affordable housing section and move that to the next meeting. If anybody violently disagrees, wave at me now. That's great. Sorry, Tim. But you got to hear Niran speak, which is great. That does mean we're going to move straight onto the section. It's a very quick section about staff, and I'm talking to give Assemblymember Pigeon time to get ready to carry on her questioning.
Yes, so to Mary again, the budget shows a 26 full-time equivalent increase in GLA-funded staff between March 23 and March 24. What is the projected level of total staff in March 2024, and what measurable output will these new posts achieve?
So, I mean, I think we do set out actually in more detail, I have to say, in this budget than in previous budgets, how that 26 is made up and which jobs those are and what we think those jobs are going to do. So I do feel we've laid that out in the paper. In terms
do you want to refer me to the paragraph so I can go back?
Well, it's section 7. Section 7, which takes you through how we get to the 26.
Okay.
Posts,
I'll
but
reread
others can talk to that if you want to. So we haven't provided a projection yet for the 31st of March 2024. That's what you asked me for, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And
when do we expect that then?
well, I think we'll be in a much better place to have a go at it in the final budget. But our problem always is that we can't see the creation of externally funded posts very far ahead of our faces. And in fact, I can illustrate this. So in 31st of March 2022, our total FTEs was 1,363. So that was our projection and our starting point for this year's budget. We get to September the 30th, and I mean I'll talk to this more in the workforce report in a different place next month. But we've got 1,467 on our establishment now, so that's about 100 new. Now we created similar 30-something roles in this year's budget, but we've had 90 new externally funded posts, even since the end of March. Now, most of those have been either in building safety, which we have seen grow in several tranches, and I've been to oversight each time. But the lion's share of that 90 are in fact in the skills bootcamp and skills multiply, which again, even in the budget that we agreed in March, we knew were likely to come, but we had no idea of the funding we were going to get or the numbers we were going to create. So at the moment, and I think we've been quite explicit about this time, here are the 26 net GLA funded posts, and in fact we've got some deletions as well, but that's the net figure. We haven't tried to predict GLA externally funded posts because from here we can't see anything. Right now, if this year's like other years, I suspect we'll be coming back to you with a GLA job number very similar to this one in the final event, and probably not much sense of our external posts.
And can you just assure us, because obviously with Oversight Committee we hear this, but as a Budget Committee, that these externally funded posts, you do always secure on cost to cover IT, office accommodation and so on, so we're not subsidising an external service, if you like, that we're providing?
No, I can absolutely assure you that, and in fact we have recently put up the charge from £6,000 to £9,000 per job.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assemblymember Hall.
Right, I've got 3 questions which I won't put to you now because of time constraints. What has been the total growth in GLA staff numbers under the current mayor, as GLA workforce reports only reflect a 3-year period of periods at a time? Second, what has the total GLA staff cost bill looked like over that time? How much have staff costs increased? Can you provide a breakdown across the directorates? And Third question, which directorates are seeing the greatest uplift in staff numbers in 23-24 and which have seen the greatest during the current mayor's term? And I'm aware some directorates have bloomed. Trying to find the figures out is exceptionally difficult. So if we could have precise answers to those, please. Thank you, Chair.
We'll get Gino or somebody to email it across, so you've got.
Yes, if I could have that repeated,
yeah,
then
no
I can get going on those answers. Thank you.
That's no worries. We'll get that organised. All right. So moving on to reserves, Assemblymember Hall.
Yes, thank you. I'll be as quick as I can. David Gallie, the GLA is expecting to start 23-24 with over 300 million in reserves. However, only 12% of the funding is planned to be used over the next 3 years. Why is this, given the GLA's previous appetite to use reserves to a greater extent?
Yeah, the thing I would emphasise in the table in Appendix G, Member Hall, is that clearly there are still decisions that are being made around the deployment of reserves, and we talked earlier about the Propel use of reserves. So you may have seen, for instance, in the Q2 report, there's actually an update on the profile of some of these reserves. So this is very much a snapshot prior to some of the finalisation of the budget. So those reserve numbers will be enhanced and will be further drawn down. But I think the key thing to emphasise is clearly we have a healthy level of reserves, albeit, of course, the budget we've just discussed also continues to draw down reserves at an important level.
Okay, there were other questions, but for time I won't ask those on that particular one. But the 23-24 budget shows the full 383 million transport services reserves being utilised in 23-24. So how will that be used?
So that's a matter for the mayor. The mayor has already taken one decision in terms of the use of that reserve, which is public, namely the council tax receipts this year for the extra £20 on Band D is being, originally that was planned in accordance with government funding agreements to be held back and given to TfL in 23-24. Given subsequent discussions with DFT, instead it became appropriate to pay it across this year, and so that we do, and so the reserve will reduce in that sense. Other plans for the reserve we'll start setting out through this group budget process.
Okay, given that the reserve is to principally fund the expansion of the ULEZ, does its planned use not suggest the mayor has made up his mind?
So where does that come from?
Well, I will straight back at you when that's
straightforward. Yeah, that absolutely hasn't come from the mayor's office. They've been very clear. The purpose of the reserve is things related to Transport for London. Specific decisions about the use of that as they're made will be announced in the normal way.
So if he decides to do it, then where's he going to get the money from?
Well, if he decides to do it, he will need to consider that as part of the decision-making process and then set that out transparently in the usual way.
Well, let's hope he doesn't, because if he listens to the public that live in those outer London areas, then he won't go ahead with it, and I'm sure some of us will be happy about that. How will the £72 million Billing Authority repayment reserve be used?
Well, it will be paid back to billing authorities.
Right.
It's their money.
Okay, I'll leave it at that, Chair, for time.
Thank you. Assemblymember Pidgeon.
Yeah, I just wanted to, looking at the reserves, and we as a committee have been quite critical that GLA is sitting on reserves in the group. And given that, capital works are really important, and I think at this time they really help the economy, shouldn't we be looking, and shouldn't you be looking in the budget to spend an awful lot more of these reserves and these reserves, and when will we see that real detail? What stage in this process? And is there any way, given we were talking earlier about Crystal Palace and clearly needing some urgent financial input there, can that be considered as part of spending some of these reserves?
I mean, there's obviously continuous work on drawing down these reserves. So, for instance, the climate change reserve, the 90 million, for instance, we're obviously looking, as I said earlier, to look to advance the spend on that. So some of the big reserves here are clearly got to be updated and will be updated as part of the final budget deliberations.
So when will we see that? Before the January budget meeting or February? When are you?
I would anticipate for the GLA mayor that it would be in the final budget in March, but clearly as we progress through the group-wide process, as David explains, there'll be obviously other movements in the reserves that will emerge for where the GLA holds that group-wide reserve, like the transport reserve or the billing reserve.
So to elucidate on that a bit further,
Yes.
take two that I'm particularly closely involved in, which is Propel and the replacement of the Young Londoners Fund and the new Museum of London.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those, we know this money will get spent quicker than this paper projects, but we don't know when, precisely because they're both very complicated external negotiations with a range of stakeholders. So this paper is accurate in that it accurately reflects our current spending patterns, but that money will get spent on not least on building a new museum well before the timetable set out here, but we just don't quite have an accurate timetable for it yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to Capital now, and we're going to go to Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. To David Gallie. What level of borrowing is required to deliver the 23-24 GLA capital programme, and what will be the total direct borrowing by the GLA by the end of 23-24?
I mean, the only borrowing that we are contemplating of any substance relates to the green bond, and obviously I'm conscious that your committees have earlier considered that in a bit more detail. I mean, substantively, I think, given where we are with the markets, we'll be very unlikely to go to the public markets or to PWLB to borrow at the moment or in the foreseeable future, but we'll probably be using our internal cash, internal borrowing, to actually finance that. That's the only really substantive item of borrowing that we're contemplating in this year.
Thank you. We touched on Crystal Palace National Sports Centre earlier, but how will the refurbishment of that be funded? And are you able yet? I know that there's commercial sensitivities, but are you able to give a figure yet?
We don't wish to disclose the figure in the public domain, as I think we've explained previously, but be assured, please, privately, that obviously we have made provision, but we cannot disclose that for commercial reasons.
Okay. And how will the refurbishment be funded?
There are funding sources identified in capital and revenue that give us a substantial budget for Crystal Palace.
Okay. And do you know when you might be able to give us more detail on that?
And the key thing is getting into negotiations with the contractor who'll do the renovations for the works. So at the moment we're in a planning phase. We're in talking to consultants around what that programme might look like, but we don't want to reveal the budget before we've done the procurement for the main contractor for obvious reasons. And so as we progress through that planning process and that procurement process, then we'll be able to say more.
And final question to David. How confident are you about the delivery of the 22-23 GLA capital programme?
And I mean, obviously there are huge pressures. I think we talked about some of them earlier on. One of the things that I've gained confidence over the last couple of years, particularly I guess in the biggest area of our capital programme being housing, is that the last couple of years housing have actually over-delivered from the forecast. And obviously we hope that will be the case this time. But obviously there remain, huge challenges, I think, for all directorates' capital programmes related to inflation and some of the delivery issues that then arise. We're obviously monitoring this very closely. The moment, obviously, in the Q2 report, you may not have had a chance to review it. It came out on Friday. We are forecasting there a underspend at the moment. We're obviously working hard, though, to try and redress that. I think, we need to keep our feet to the fire with colleagues around ensuring we can try and spend up as forecast.
Thank you. You're right. I haven't had a chance to review that report. What is the level of the underspend forecast at the moment?
The full year forecast for capital shows a forecast underspend of £90 million against a budget of just over £2 billion.
90 million against 2 billion. Okay, thank you. I think in the interest of time, I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. The last section is around the climate budget, and this is Caroline Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, with the climate budget, really good to see the focus on mechanical ventilation and LED lights for this building. There's one point in Appendix K in the budget document on page 83. It's the fourth bullet under 6, the measures and the measures in 2023 to 24, and it says that the upgrading all the lights within the building to LEDs was outside the scope of the recent building refurbishment project. Does that mean that lights were put in during the refurbishment project that were not LED, or does it mean that that you are now going to upgrade lights that were not upgraded earlier that are LED?
So I'm pretty sure it's the latter of those.
Could you come back to us and just confirm that?
I can't imagine we would have done the first, but
I hope not.
No,
just useful to check.
Given all the focus we had on this being a green, sustainable building, I believe it would be the second, but we will confirm.
Okay, and so a question, and I'm not sure if this is for Phil or for David, but how feasible do you think it is for the City Hall building and Trafalgar Square to achieve net zero by 2030?
I probably need to get some advice from Simon Grinter around the feasibility of those two sites. It's probably beyond my competence. Perhaps we can write to you on that one.
If you could write to us on that one. There's another thing that would be really useful to understand with that is how the climate accounting is going to work for energy used by both those sites. If you go on to make the power purchase agreements that were TfL agreements and are now going to be GLA group agreements, is the energy consumed at City Hall and at the Trafalgar Square site going to be part of the power purchase agreement piece of work, or is it going to be just separate? So
no,
useful
the
to
intention
understand.
is that the GLA would be involved, albeit a small part of that overall PPA. So our sites would be in that as and when we have a group-wide PPA that would involve the Met and Fire and the others.
But of course, this building is like we're on zero emission energy already for the building. So in terms of that, yeah, great to be part of the PPA, price certainty, etc. But it's not going to change carbon emissions from electricity because we already use renewable electricity for this building. To come back into your previous point, the way I look at it, Assembly Member, and obviously this is the first one of these we've had, yep. But I think what is absolutely key is the graph that you see on the bottom of page 81, and basically you can see real progress made in terms of reducing emissions, which is good. You can see a projection about what's going to happen in the future. And so the first order of business is securing that projection, and he's saying, right, there are a list of specific projects, like ensuring that they're funded, built into budgets. And then the second order of business is saying, well, hang on, right, that projection doesn't give us net zero. Why not? What are we going to do about it? And I think as we look through all the submissions from each group organisation, that's the philosophy we're going to need to take, because we need to secure the benefits that we know how we can secure, and then the things that inevitably will be harder, we need to then start the difficult conversations about how we address them.
Thank you, and thank you for picking up on that graph, because that was the next thing I was going to come to. So that's it from me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hall.
Right, 4 very quick questions I've got that even Assembly Member Russell would be proud of me. They'll take far too long, so if I submit them to you, if we could have answers as soon as possible, I'd be grateful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll make sure those questions go across. Right, mindful of the time, what I'd like to do, that gets us to the end of the questioning session. Is there anything else anybody would like to ask? I don't think so. So it's time to thank our guests for attending this morning, for their answers to our questions. This is where we do that usual joke now, which I think is standard, which is you can stay if you want to. No one ever has, so I think I'm going to stop saying it, to be honest. But thank you for your time. We do appreciate it. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 6 is Mayor's decision lists. Can I ask the committee to note the Mayor's decision lists for the period 6th of May to the 3rd of November 2022 and decide whether to highlight any issues for detailed consideration? Thank you. Can we note the committee's work programme for 2022-23 for the Budget and Performance Committee?
Noted.
And then the date of next meeting of the committee will be held on the 7th of December 22 at 10 a.m. in committee rooms 2 and 3 for City Hall. As I have no other urgent business today, that concludes the meeting.